There's no question that Final Fantasy VII has made its impact on the video game industry. Released in 1997, it arrived just in the nick of time, in the sweet spot for the transition from 2D to 3D. But what's interesting is the story behind it. What happened at Square during the development of Final Fantasy VII, and how was Nintendo involved in all this? And that's only part of the questions that I want to answer today, along with taking a comprehensive look at the game itself. With Final Fantasy VII Remake out and Rebirth around the corner, I feel it's a perfect time to look at the original and see the experience that a lot of us had all those years ago. So grab a seat, get a drink, and clear your schedule, cause we're gonna be here for a while. Hey there buddy, I'm the dadliest man in town, and today I want to tell you the story of Final Fantasy VII. We're going to be taking a look at development, gameplay, mechanics, the full story, keeping in mind that I might miss an event here or there, and at the end I'll try to concisely describe the experience of replaying this game after such a long time, and I'll give you my thoughts on it. A quick note though, I will be playing the Steam version for ease of recording purposes. There are a few differences between the original versions of the game, specifically between the Japanese and international releases, but nothing that will make both the European and American players find big differences in their playthrough nowadays. Also, as a word of warning, we will be going through the entire main plot. While I know FF7 Remake seems to have an alternate and somewhat extended take on the story of FF7, the story does mostly follow the overarching plot, so if this is the first time you'll be going through this game, be aware that there might be spoilers throughout this review that will give away critical points that will probably be in Rebirth when it comes out. To fully understand the development of Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, we'll have to take a look at another company alongside Square. Namely, we'll have to take a look at Nintendo, since they played a pivotal role in how things went down. But first, let's talk about Square. In 1987, Square was a small and relatively unknown Japanese video game company with no true hit to their name. Their games were doing reasonably well, but they had yet to produce a true blockbuster hit. Hironobu Sakaguchi, a game designer at Square, felt he needed to change this. He thought about creating an RPG, much like Enix's popular Dragon Quest series. But he didn't just want to copy Dragon Quest, he wanted to improve on what Dragon Quest did. Essentially, what he wanted to do was shake up and revolutionize the genre. Now, Square gave Sakaguchi the funding that he needed to create this game, but he was so convinced that this game would be the last time he would work on a video game that he named it Final Fantasy. What he didn't realize is that this would not be the last game that he would ever make. It would be the start of a long-lasting and beloved series. And that's what it did. Final Fantasy sold really well in Japan, but unfortunately there was no Western release yet. And why? Well, some sources claim that back then there was a misconception that American players were not as interested in the complexity of the systems that came with RPGs. I don't fully agree with this, as the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons proved that there was a market for RPGs. But it was believed that the Western market preferred simpler games centered around fighting or platforming. Now, this belief might have been influenced by Japanese developers believing that JRPGs didn't sell as well in the United States as they did in Japan, but to be honest, the offerings surrounding JRPGs at the time in the West weren't all that big. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong on this. I don't have 40 years of game history in my head, but what I believe from back in the late 80s, the only offerings you had in the JRPG genre were Dragon Quest, which was renamed Dragon Warrior, and I believe a game called Miracle Warriors for the Sega Master System. When Final Fantasy I made its way to the US market in July of 1990, it was already after the release of Final Fantasy III in Japan. The game did exceptionally well in the US, however, what this didn't lead to is the localization of the entire series for American audiences. From what I've read in some interviews with Sakaguchi, it was apparently seen as a risky move to localize these other games to the US market since they were so similar to Final Fantasy I. I don't fully agree with this because Final Fantasy II, for example, had a wildly different leveling system. The next big step came when Square upgraded to the Super Famicom when they released Final Fantasy IV in Japan in August of 1991. Final Fantasy IV would be the second title to be released in North America, but due to the last title being Final Fantasy I, the choice was made to rebrand this one to Final Fantasy II outside of Japan. Now I understand why they would do this initially. Releasing Final Fantasy IV under that title in the West would have confused players. In fact, Europe and the US wouldn't see true releases of the real Final Fantasy II until the release of Final Fantasy Origins for the PlayStation in 2003. But then surely Final Fantasy V had to be released in the West next, right? Well, actually no, and the reasoning behind it is strange. Some sources claim that the translation of Final Fantasy V took so long, it was no longer viable since Final Fantasy VI was already nearing completion and Square would rather focus on that one instead. This claim always seemed a bit weird to me. If Final Fantasy V was already being translated, they either started translating 6 during development, or for some reason it just went a lot faster than 5. It's really unclear about why this happened. However, by the time that Final Fantasy VI or III did release in the West, it already had a bit of brand recognition. During the period between the releases of 2 and 3, Square had released what they would name spin-offs of the franchise. This would be rebrands of other series like the Saga games, which would be rebranded as Final Fantasy Legend during their releases from 89 to 91, along with the original version of which is now known as Sword of Mana, which would be released as Final Fantasy Adventure in the US, and also known as Final Fantasy Mystic Quest in Europe. Mystic Quest didn't do all that well. It was considered a sort of a dumbed-down experience to Final Fantasy II. Players were waiting for a true sequel to that game, and that's what happened when Final Fantasy VI was released in late 1994, being known as Final Fantasy III in the West. Final Fantasy VI did okay in sales numbers. While it dominated the Japanese market, becoming the best-selling game of 1994 in that region, it only ended up being the 8th best-selling SNES game in the US. However, what it did do was reinvigorate the attention towards the Final Fantasy IP again in that area, paving the way for the next installment. And during 1994, planning sessions for Final Fantasy VII were already underway. Originally, it was planned to be another 2D project for the Super Nintendo. This isn't strange. While 3D games were slowly but surely becoming the new standard set to take over in a few years, it makes sense that by this time, most developers would still find their skill set heavily grounded within 2D game development. In 1994, a lot of developers would still look at 3D as a big challenge, and with a big title like Final Fantasy, I can fully understand that Square was basically faced with two options. You either stick to the tried and true, or try to advance this series into a new era. Keep in mind, this would be a good 2 years before the release of the Nintendo 64, so by that time I figured that dev kits were probably being shipped out and developers were still trying to get a feel for how to work with this new 3D technology. And for Square, this was a pivotal point, because it is precisely the development between the Nintendo 64 and Final Fantasy VII which makes this story so interesting. See, throughout the 90s, Square had grown from this small studio to a Nintendo-affiliated powerhouse, mostly due to the success of the Final Fantasy series. But Hironobu Sakaguchi wanted something more. He wanted Final Fantasy VII to just shake the foundations of not only RPGs but also in the gaming industry itself. However, Sakaguchi had a hands-on approach all the way from Final Fantasy I to Final Fantasy VI, and he wanted to step back from the nitty-gritty everyday work. Unfortunately, you can't do that if you don't have the right people in the right place. But luckily for him, he did. Enter Yoshinori Kitase and Tetsuya Nomura. Both already members of the Square team and the people that Sakaguchi put forward to take over some of his tasks on the series. Kitase was already well known in the company, working his way up from scenario planning all the way to director by the time that Final Fantasy VII came around. Kitase was apparently known as a film enthusiast, and he wanted to bring his feel for cinematography into gaming. Then there was Tetsuya Nomura, by now known as a staple name within Square Enix. Nomura started off as a debugger at Square before working his way up to monster designer and eventually principal character designer for Final Fantasy VII, forming most of the creative direction for this installment. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and it goes back to the choice that Square had to make, which I mentioned earlier. With console technology advancing rapidly, they still had to make a tough decision about the game's visual style. They essentially had those two choices, either go for the existing pixel art style or go all out on 3D. From what I can tell from various interviews and sources, there were multiple ideas being uttered during the planning phase, and there was even a 3D tech demo released featuring 3D models of characters from Final Fantasy VI. I think by the time that this tech demo came along, it kinda told you enough about which direction they wanted to take. But here came the issue with the plan that they wanted. The scope for Final Fantasy VII was enormous at the time, probably too big to even try an attempt on the Super Famicom, and unfortunately back then the only other option the team had at Square was the Sega Mega Drive, which for them wasn't really an option. And I think this is the best time to switch over the story to take a look at Nintendo. See, Nintendo always favored having a tight leash on developers working on games for their consoles. You can defend this in the sense of quality control, but after a good amount of years this led to the relationship between Nintendo and Square turning sour. And as time went on, the landscape evolved with the arrival of the Nintendo 64 and Sony's PlayStation. And this brought with it a new rival on the scene. That once unshakable hold that Nintendo had was starting to slip away, and possibly for the better. Now, this internal struggle between the two companies did not come out of the blue. It had been building up over the course of a couple of years. In 1991, Square was forced by Nintendo to delay the release of a game called Romancing Saga in Japan due to bugs. Square, however, ran into issues with trying to solve said bugs because of the memory constraints on the cartridges that they had to use. Now, these bugs weren't unfixable, they just needed more space on the cartridge. So Square requested Nintendo to use the new 12MB cartridge for their game to solve this. But they were denied by Nintendo because they were saving these new cartridges in favor of Enix's Dragon Quest V. Because of this denial, Square was forced to cut parts out of the final release of Romancing Saga. And while that game did exceptionally well for when it was released, this put a considerable strain on the relationship between the two companies. In comes Sony. And despite being a new name on the block in the video game market, the way they interacted and assisted developers led to many of them suddenly favoring them over Nintendo. This was a smart move by Sony. They did not have the experience and brand recognition in this sector yet to have developers come to them naturally. But by offering developers active support and making the transition easier, it gave them the chance to position themselves on the market. Now, Sony wasn't completely unfamiliar with game and console production. Back in 1991, there were talks about Sony creating a CD version of the Super Nintendo. This never came to fruition due to the internal struggles between the two companies, but this is such a big story in and of itself that I'll spare you the details for now. The important part from this is that this joint partnership failing is one of the factors that led directly into Sony's development of the PlayStation. Trying to get more companies on their side, Sony reached out to multiple developers, and this finally led to Square, one of the biggest names in the business, shocking everyone by announcing in 1996 that they were shifting their entire lineup to Sony. This in turn meant that they were taking FF7 along to the PlayStation, and after a certain amount of time, a lot of developers had switched over to Sony. One of the driving factors behind this exodus was the economic advantage of developing games on PlayStation's CDs as opposed to the Nintendo 64's cartridges. CDs were just cheaper to produce, and on top of that they could also store more data. They did bring their own set of challenges, but we'll get to that shortly. Square jumping ship finalized the rift between them and Nintendo. Here was a developer with a wildly popular series, and not only were they leaving the partnership that they had for so many years, they were also recruiting other developers to do the same. In any case, the stage was set, and with the onset of Square now working together with Sony, the development for FF7 was well underway. But development of the game was rushed, with Square having less time to work on Final Fantasy VII compared to their initial schedule. A lot of changes were implemented late in the development cycle, which led to the initially planned release date of December 1996 to be postponed to January of 1997. Along with all the changes that were happening during this time, the number of CDs needed for the game increased as well, from 2 to 3. The change to CDs as the carrying medium brought another great change to the series. Final Fantasy was always known for having a great soundtrack, and when you thought about a Final Fantasy soundtrack, you thought about Nobuo Uematsu. Uematsu made a name for himself as the series composer on the Famicom and the Super Famicom by creating iconic melodies for each iteration, regardless of the limited space that he had because of the use of cartridges for Nintendo systems. Uematsu always made great themes for Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VI had some impressive scores, the battle theme being my favorite, but thanks to the CD being able to store more memory, he felt he could finally let loose. This led to some amazing songs for FF7, like my personal favorite Trail of Blood, which plays during a certain event we'll go through during the story, and the iconic Aeris' theme. However, as he would later find out, composing songs for the PlayStation brought its own set of issues. The team had never worked with CDs before, and with Nintendo's original cartridges, the read speed was a lot higher than reading it off of the CDs. Because of this, Uematsu felt that he had to decrease some of the music quality to ensure that there were no pauses in the gameplay to wait for the PlayStation to load in the music. Keep in mind, this was new technology, and looking back, Uematsu apparently stated that he wished he'd taken more liberty with the audio quality. He wanted to include vocals inside the score, something that he would actively do in the next installment. But let's save that game for when we get to it in the future. And finally, no pun intended, a Final Fantasy game isn't complete without designs and artwork by Yoshitaka Amano. Amano was normally the character and monster designer for the series. However, with Nomura now taking over that role, Amano would mainly make the title logo as he's done for every Final Fantasy game to date, alongside with some promotional artwork and some character artworks in his own style. Amano's style of art is, I want to say, iconic. I don't even know how to do it justice by trying to describe it honestly. It always reminds me of the Japanese ukiyo-e style of art, but to be fair, my knowledge of the artistic world is too lacking to even try and explain it for you. I know he used a lot of watercolors and his artwork has an almost ethereal feel to it, but I think all of this information gives us a clear enough image about the development of the game, so I think it's about time that we start on the story. Welcome to Final Fantasy VII. The intro starts us off with looking at what seems to be the night sky. A droning sound resonates in the background. The camera twists and turns for a few seconds before we see the face of a young girl who is fixated on a green glow coming out of some pipes. She gets up and moves towards the street. The camera starts zooming out and we lose sight of her after a while. We're treated, however, to a beautiful shot of the city of Midgar before the title flashes onto the screen. The camera zooms into the heart of the city, and a train rolls into Midgar's Mako Reactor No. 1. This reactor is one of the many that provides power to the city. We're then introduced to the main character in the game, Cloud Strife. Along with him are a group of individuals, members of the rebel group, Avalanche. Almost immediately, we're thrown into our first battle. We'll be playing as Cloud since he's the only member of the party for now. If you're used to playing JRPGs from this era, the battle screen should be a simple affair. We'll have the standard options for attack, magic, and items. Pressing left or right on the D-pad will give us the option to either defend or change our character's placement to the back or front lines of combat. This will be of some importance later on, but we'll get to that when we get into the system proper. The initial battles are against a few guards, and they are trivial at best, allowing us, the player, to only get a bit of a feel for the combat system and to learn the layout of the menus. The goal of the mission that we're on is to strike a blow against the Shinra Company, a private company that rules over the city of Midgar. The leader of the group that we're with, a hulk of a man named Barrett, approaches Cloud. He seemingly doesn't trust him and asks him for his name. Now, I think this is normally something you start off with when you start with a dangerous mission like this, but to each his own. Barrett wastes no time in explaining the plan. They intend to infiltrate the reactor core and plant a timed explosive device in the hopes of taking out the structure. Now, their aim is to weaken Shinra's grip on Mako energy, a resource extracted by these reactors. Barrett apparently has doubts about Cloud since he claims that he used to be part of Shinra's elite group called Soldier. However, since he's in desperate need of help, he does agree to let Cloud come along as security because of his supposed combat experience. During our way towards the inner reactor, we get to know a bit more about Barrett's motivations. According to him, the Mako reactors use the literal life force of the planet to generate power. However, Barrett claims that this energy is finite, and Shinra is slowly killing the planet by doing so. He also isn't a fan of the city of Midgar itself, as it symbolizes the power that the Shinra company has over the common people. We follow Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge, 3 fellow members of Avalanche who guide us through the Mako reactor until we make it to the reactor core, where we're supposed to plant an explosive. Right before we set the bomb, a strange voice tells us to watch out. We don't know where it's from, but it'll become a lot more important later on in the story. A few seconds later, we're thrown into our first boss battle of the game. This first boss is against the Guard Scorpion, and it's partially an extension of the battles that we fought up until now, in the sense that it's meant to make the player familiar with several boss mechanics. There's also a fun tidbit which I remember screwed me over when I played this fight for the first time when I was younger. During the battle, a message shows up on the top of the screen that says, "Attack while its tail's up." Trying to be quick in getting through the game, I did just that. However, there's a second part to the message that says, "and it will counterattack with its tail laser." And it was probably 0.5 seconds after I pressed the attack button at that time when I realized I screwed up. The tail laser is the strongest attack that the Guard Scorpion has, and if you're still learning the menu by this time, there's a possibility of taking some serious damage. Instead, we'll wait until its tail is down and then use Cloud's bolt magic and Barrett's basic attack. Alongside the regular attacks, there is another meter in the battle screen called Limit Break. In the game, every party member possesses a limit meter that gradually fills up when they endure damage. Once this meter is completely charged, the character gains the ability to execute a unique, powerful attack called a Limit Break. Typically, characters have access to 7 distinct limit breaks, though there are exceptions. These attacks are divided into several levels of strength. Initially, characters begin with 1 limit break and progressively acquire the next ones by defeating foes or successfully executing the other ones. Using all the attacks at our disposal, we're able to take care of the Guard Scorpion and destroy it. However, we set a timer when we place the bomb, and it's still ticking down. We'll have to retrace our steps, going out the same way as we came in. It's important to note that this timer will not stop for anything. It will continue on the main screen, during battle, and even in the menu screen. There's enough time to escape though, so there shouldn't be too much difficulty to get out. After we make it out of the reactor, it's destroyed because of the bomb we set. Barrett orders the group to scatter and meet at the subway station. On our way there, we meet the girl that we saw earlier during the introduction. She gets knocked down by panicked civilians, and we tell her to get to safety. We notice the flowers that she's selling though, and we buy one from her for a gil, this world's currency. When we almost get to the station, we're surrounded by Shinra troops coming at us from all sides. We can choose to fight them, but it's no use as they'll immediately be replaced by new ones. Instead, we'll take the last resort and jump off the bridge onto the moving train underneath. Inside the train, the rest of the team is already present, afraid that we didn't make it because we weren't at the station. They're rattled when they hear a few knocks on the door of the moving train, and they're even more surprised when Cloud swoops in, acting like it wasn't really a big deal. We'll make our way to Sector 7 and head to 7th Heaven, a bar owned by Tifa, a mutual acquaintance of both Cloud and Barrett. Coincidentally, the bar also serves as the hideout for Avalanche. After we find ourselves at the bar, we get our payment from Barrett. We're also provided with a narrative choice which will influence our standing with one of the characters. We can choose to give the flower that we bought from the flower girl to either Tifa or Barrett's daughter Marlene. It's important to note that there is a hidden value in the game which determines your relationship with characters. The way you treat them during the course of the story will alter a hidden value in the game, and it will determine a scene later on. But we'll save that for later. For this section, I chose to give the flower to Tifa. Tifa actually knows Cloud from the time when they were kids, as they're from the same hometown apparently. We're also treated to a small recollection as Cloud and Tifa reminisce about a time when they were kids. They met near a well and Cloud says that he wants to go to Midgar to join Soldier. And this little tidbit is going to be integral later on in the story. When we get back to the present day, Tifa asks Cloud if he wants to do another job for them. He'll think about it, but it's going to cost the Avalanche team a hefty penny. To be fair though, I think at this point, Cloud is more motivated by his familiarity with Tifa. He and Barrett don't seem to be on such good terms. We'll discuss some more of the details of the mission before we head off the next day. Before we go, Barrett asks us if we have an idea about how materia works, and I think this is as good a time if any to talk about one of the core mechanics in Final Fantasy VII. Now the systems regarding materia are relatively straightforward, but they do have a lot of depth. Both our weapons and our armor come equipped with slots designed to hold materia, although some might lack these slots altogether. When we put a piece of materia into these slots, our character acquires abilities. They will also receive both positive and negative effects of the materia, such as stat adjustments. The abilities and effects are linked to the materia, not to the character, which means if you remove the materia, you'll lose those as well. When you select the materia in the menu, the lower left corner of the screen will display some information about it, including the accumulated amount of ability points, which I'll explain in a bit. Without having materia equipped, all characters are relegated to their basic commands like attack, item, defend, and so on. However, by using materia, any character can basically fulfill any role in the party. You want Barrett to be the healer? Slot some restore materia into his weapon or armor, and he'll be the healer. Granted, some characters have better stats suited for healing, but in my playthrough I didn't notice that there was a real meta setup which works the best. I'm not one for min-maxing in my RPGs. Now regarding ability points, or AP as it's also known, after each battle we'll receive experience points, AP, and Gil. AP functions similarly to experience points, but it's directed towards our materia. Once a piece of materia gets enough ability points, it levels up, and it increases a percentage of the associated skill. There's also a possibility, like with magic materia, that we learn the next level of a certain spell. It's important to know that the amount of ability points that we can get after battle can be influenced by the weapons and the armor that we're using at the time. When we select our weapon or armor, we'll see a growth indicator on the screen. You can have a couple of options here, namely normal, double, triple, or none. Normal means that our materia is going to get the regular amount of ability points after combat. Double means that we're going to get double the indicated ability points, while triple, I think you know what it means. None will mean that our materia gains no AP in the equipment it's slotted in, but the trade-off is that these items usually have higher stats in the sections that we find them. It's also important to know that these adjustments only affect the materia in the specific weapon or armor, meaning that if our weapon has the none status while our armor has a normal status, the materia in our armor will still gain ability points after battle. During the course of the game, we'll find several different types of materia. These can be distinguished by their colors and have a variety of effects. Green materia is going to be the most common in the beginning of the game. This is magic materia, and it gives access to specific spells per each equipped materia. Blue materia is known as support materia. They can be used in combinations which will give the materia it's combined with added effects. We'll go more in depth on this system in a bit. Yellow materia is command materia. Equipping these will give us specific commands in battle, allowing us to do things like learn enemy skills or steal items from enemies. Then there's purple materia. These give passive effects and stat boosts to the equipped character, and in my opinion, this is some of the best materia in the game. And finally, there's red materia for summons. There's not a lot to be said about this. The summon materia all have their specific linked summon, and if you're familiar with the Final Fantasy mythology, you'll know exactly what it does. If you're not, the short story is that the summon materia will allow you to call upon a powerful creature to attack the enemy. Now, I mentioned materia combinations. There's actually a few ways to achieve these. Some of the weapons and armor have linked slots. You'll recognize these by the materia slot being linked to another one. In the case of linked slots, any two materia can go into them, but a support materia has to be one of them to form a combo effect. You can, for example, slot fire and ice magic together to make them do a mix of the two damage-wise. The most common materia combination is a magic materia linked with a support materia named All. All makes the linked materia affect all enemies or allies. It works wonders with a restore materia, essentially letting us heal the entire party for the same magic point cost as a single cast. There's even more combinations to be found. Some of these don't even need to go in a linked slot. For example, the cover materia lets the character holding the materia take a blow for one of the other party members. By leveling this materia, the chance of covering an attack for a teammate grows percentage-wise. In itself, this is already a good thing, but later on in the game, we'll get access to both the HP Plus and counter materia. Now, HP Plus does exactly what you'd expect, but the counter materia lets a character that's been attacked counter the move with a basic attack. The chance is initially very low, just like the cover materia, but if we level it often enough, it essentially provides a free basic attack turn. Now, if you combine the counter materia with a cover materia, I think you get an idea of the sort of combos that you can build with characters along the way. There's an insane amount of these combinations to be made, and a big part of why this system is so great, even after all these years. Our new mission will be to destroy the Sector 5 reactor. Tifa will be joining us on this mission, and we'll start off mostly like we did on the last one, on a train towards the reactor itself. Unfortunately, during our train ride, something sets off the ID scanner inside the train, and Shinra forces are on their way to detain us. With no other option, we join Barret and Tifa at the front of the train and jump out. We're landing just a little bit outside of the Sector 5 reactor area, so we still need to walk our way there. We continue through the tunnels, making our way through what seems to be Midgar's ventilation system, before infiltrating the reactor's core and planting the explosive, this time without a timer. Just like the last time, Cloud has a vision, more vivid than the last one. We see Tifa standing near the lifeless body of her father, and she wants to know whether someone called Sephiroth did this to him. As she runs off, we return to our senses and we continue to place the bomb, just like last time. From here on, the name Sephiroth is going to be thrown out in the game a lot. At this point in the game, he exists as this shadow of a person who apparently was one of the greatest soldiers in Shinra's arsenal. We'll get bits and pieces of information about him during the course of the game, but the gist of the story is that Shinra published that he died several years ago. Unlike the last time where we managed to escape after fighting the guard scorpion, this time we seem to be caught as we get out of the reactor. To our surprise, the president of Shinra appears, taunting us for our failure as he doesn't seem to even care that we set the bomb in the reactor. He recognizes Cloud as a former soldier but doesn't remember his name, as Cloud was apparently not on the level of Sephiroth. Before the president manages to escape in his helicopter, he leaves behind a mechanical enemy called the Airbuster, which is going to act as a boss fight. The fight with the Airbuster brings with it a mechanic we haven't seen before in the game. These are side attacks. They're not new to the Final Fantasy series, as they've been present since Final Fantasy I. The Airbuster has an attack called the Big Bomber. It does a good amount of damage, but nothing that we can't heal ourselves through. The Big Bomber can also only be used for the first 4 turns of the enemy, as after it runs out of ammo and it has to resort to its weaker Energy Ball attack. This fight can actually be over pretty quick. Attacking the Airbuster from behind does around 5 times the normal amount of damage, making the fight extremely easy if you manage to have a limit break charged from the beginning. After defeating the Airbuster, it triggers a self-destruct mechanism, exploding on the bridge and destroying the structure. Cloud is hanging on by a thread. Tifa tries to help him, but Barret pulls her back, knowing that it's impossible to do anything in this situation. As another explosion goes off, presumably from the explosive in the reactor, Cloud loses his grip, falling from the bridge, leaving Barret and Tifa unsure if he survives. We wake up in an unexpected place, a flower bed in a small church in Sector 5. The same mysterious flower girl from before is standing right next to us. She introduces herself as Aeris and explains that her flowers saved us by breaking our fall. Now, there was actually a bit of a discussion years prior about how to pronounce Aeris' name. Apparently in the original FF7, her name was literally translated from the Japanese language, being that it ended in an S-like sound. Therefore, it was originally known as Aeris. With the FF7 Remake out now, however, the name has been changed to Aerith. But considering that we're doing this piece on the original FF7, I'm going to stick with Aeris. That doesn't mean I'm going to consider Aerith a wrong pronunciation. For the time that FF7 was released, Aeris was just the name that everyone knew her by. So that's what I'm going to stick with for now. Aerith is correct. But I think this actually helps us distinguish between the character from FF7 and FF7 Remake. Now back to the story. As Cloud regains his senses, he realizes where we are. We're far from the place where we fought the Airbuster and where we left our comrades behind. Unfortunately, Cloud doesn't get a lot of time to recover from his fall. After a small talk with Aeris, someone shows up in the church. This is Reno of the Turks, a special group within Shinra. They're generally considered combat experts, but they're also used by Shinra to do their dirty work, like kidnapping and assassinations. Aeris is seemingly upset by him showing up, and she asks us if we want to stay with her and act as her bodyguard in return for a date. Cloud accepts and we start to run away from Reno. In the next room, we make our way through the church structure. Aeris has trouble keeping up with us and falls down when the Shinra forces open fire at us. Now this brings us into a fun little minigame. Aeris will try to make her way up again but will be chased by the Shinra troops. We'll have to move up towards the ceiling where a few barrels are standing. We can push the barrels down, leading to some segments where they hit the troopers and allow Aeris to continue until she reaches us. We finally escape through a hole in the church rooftop. Cloud and Aeris make their way across the slums to get to another part of Sector 5. Aeris remarks that the Turks have been after her for a while now, and Cloud thinks that they're trying to recruit her into Soldier. Now, we've mentioned Soldier quite a few times now, so I think a quick explanation is in order. Soldier is yet another branch of a fighting force that's employed by Shinra. They're apparently even stronger than the Turks, and the process of getting into Soldier is pretty much shrouded in mystery. It's known that Soldier members are infused with Mako, giving them advanced physical abilities which far surpass normal humans. However, these experiments also give them a sort of glow in their eyes, making it possible to easily distinguish a normal human from one who's been in Soldier. There's honestly not a lot of further information of Soldier in FF7. It's mentioned mostly by Cloud in relation to himself and Sephiroth, but we're able to pick up little bits of information throughout the story. Members of Soldier are apparently split into 3 levels: 3rd class, 2nd class, and 1st class. 1st class members are apparently Shinra's cream of the crop. They're the strongest people that they have in their employment, and they're often used in propaganda purposes, like we noticed with how Sephiroth is depicted as a famous war hero. Cloud and Aeris eventually arrive at Aeris' home, where we're gonna spend the night. Aeris says the day after she'll guide us back to Sector 7. When we get to her house, Aeris' mother, Elmira, doesn't like the way that she's interacting with us, and she asks us if we're willing to sneak out in the middle of the night, leaving Aeris behind. We do just that, making sure that Aeris doesn't know we're leaving. We get out of the house but find out that Aeris was already aware that we were trying to leave, as she's waiting for us near the exit of Sector 5. On our way, we take a small break at a dilapidated playground. Aeris climbs the slide and opens up a bit about herself. She asks Cloud about what rank he was in Soldier, and he tells her that he was in the 1st class. Apparently, Aeris used to have a boyfriend who was in the same rank as him, but before he can ask her what his name was, we see Tifa passing by in the distance on a cart towards the wall market. We make our way over there, and by talking to the local people, we find out that she's currently in the Honeybee Inn, a less than savory establishment under the control of a man called Don Corneo. Unfortunately for us, when we try to get access to the place, it seems only women are allowed, so Cloud can get inside. Aeris has an idea though. She wants Cloud to dress up as a woman. We just need to find someone who can make the clothes for him. We head towards the local clothes store, but it is there that we run into a problem. The owner of the clothes store is apparently in a bit of a slump. He's done with just making clothing every day and he wants something that's going to challenge him. Aeris pulls the man to the side and asks him if he's willing to make a dress for Cloud. This apparently intrigues him enough to give it a try and he'll head back to the clothes store. To make the disguise more convincing though, we'll need more than just the dress. We need to get a wig, some cologne, and a tiara. Now, most of this stuff is optional. It's not needed to get all of the mentioned items besides the wig, but it's a fun side mission and it will influence the events inside the Honeybee Inn. When we finally get all the things we need, we'll make our way towards the Honeybee Inn with Aeris. The guard will let us inside and we find out that the owner of the establishment, Don Corneo, is looking for a bride, and he's going to choose between Aeris, Cloud, and one other person. The guard tells us to wait in the cellar and guides us there. Tifa is already downstairs waiting for her audition with Corneo. Aeris starts talking to Tifa and mentions that we're also around. Tifa looks at Cloud a bit confused until she realizes that he's disguised as a woman. It turns out Tifa went to see the Dawn because after the Sector 5 incident, they found a suspicious person who was apparently scouting for the Avalanche hideout. Eventually, they discovered that the person reported to the Dawn, and Tifa decided to go to Wall Market under the guise of being Corneo's bride to find out what he knew and why he was so interested in finding the Avalanche base. One of Corneo's goons shows up and tells us that he's ready to receive us. Corneo lines up the three for an inspection. Now, if we took all the correct items from the dress side mission, Corneo will choose Cloud. However, for this run, Corneo chose Aeris as his woman for the night while the others are shipped off to another room. We're brought to the room and there's a bit of a weird atmosphere. The men in the room start zombie walking towards us and we'll have to walk around the room for a bit before Cloud has had enough. He throws off his disguise and we're put into a battle with the goons. They're nothing of a challenge, a few basic attacks will pretty much take care of them. After we're done, we'll head straight to Corneo with a hilarious cutscene where Tifa, Aeris, and Cloud threaten Corneo to cut off his... But as we're confronting him, Corneo reveals something sinister. Shinra plans to drop the plate above Sector 7 in an effort to destroy Avalanche, taking many innocent lives with them. As Corneo activates a hidden trap door, we fall into the dark sewers below where we have to find one of his pets called Apps. After we defeat the thing, we know what we have to do. We need to head to Sector 7 in an effort to stop Shinra's plan and protect the inhabitants from disaster. We switch over to Shinra headquarters where one of the leaders, Reeve, tries to oppose the plate drop on Sector 7. Heidegger shows up and tells the president that the preparations are complete, and the Turks have been assigned to ensure that Shinra's plan is executed. Heidegger walks away, laughing as always, and Reeve tries to say something, but the president interrupts him by telling him that he's tired and he should take a mandatory few days off. When we reach Sector 7, we find out that Barrett and the others have already engaged the Shinra at the top of the column that supports the plate. Tifa asks Aeris to find Barrett's daughter Marlene at 7th Heaven and get her to safety while we do our best to assist the rest of the team. While we run up the staircase, we find the others wounded, quite possibly even dying. We try to assure them that they'll be okay, but it seems it might just be too late. When we get to the top of the tower, Barrett is on his own, firing his gun arm at the Shinra troops. Reno, one of the Turks that we met earlier in the church, appears at the top of the column and will be forced into a fight with him. Reno has an annoying attack called Pyramid that he'll use throughout the fight. When he uses this attack, one party member is confined within a yellow pyramid shape. They can't execute their turn, and for the game, they're marked as defeated, which could lead to a game over if all members become trapped in these things. To rescue the trapped character, another character that is not trapped can do a regular attack or a magic attack on the character to break the spell. When Reno's HP runs out, he will stop fighting the party and instead arm the bomb that's connected to the plate. Unfortunately, when he does this, we're already too late. Reno and his superior, another Turk called Sang, escape, and to make matters worse, It seems they've captured Aeris at the same time before they fly off in their helicopter. We try to disarm the bomb, but it seems there's just not enough time to figure out how it can be done. As the plate begins to fall down, Barrett grabs a nearby cable and he tells Cloud and Tifa to grab onto him. Together, we swing out of the sector before the plate collapses and falls, killing all of the Sector 7 residents and reducing it to rubble. Now, I want to take a moment and talk about how heavy this scene is. It shows that Shinra cares so little about human life that they're willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that they get things their way, even killing off an entire sector filled with countless people. It's supposed to give off a shock factor and cement Shinra as not just an evil organization, but truly heartless people that need to be stopped at any cost. Outside the sector, near the playground that we were at with Aeris, Barrett has a breakdown. The deaths of Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse, and quite possibly Marlene, are just too much for him to handle. However, Tifa tells Barrett that during the battle with Reno, Aeris mentioned to Tifa that she was safe, possibly referring to Marlene. Obviously, Aeris knew that Marlene wouldn't be safe in Sector 7, and there's only one other place that we can think of where she could have hidden her. We head to Aeris' house and find that Aeris brought Marlene to her mother before being kidnapped, reuniting Barrett with his daughter. Elmira reveals to the group that she found Aeris 15 years ago as an orphan at the nearby train station. After Aeris' mother died, Elmira took her in and raised her as if she were her own child. We find out that Aeris and her mother apparently escaped from a research laboratory. We don't yet know what they were researching them for though. Strangely enough, Aeris didn't seem too sad about her mother dying, stating that she had already returned to the planet, something Elmira couldn't make sense of at the time. We also find out that Elmira's husband went off to war, and after a while, Aeris shows up in front of her asking her not to cry. When Elmira tries to find out what's wrong, Aeris tells her that someone dear to her has just died, and that their spirit has already returned to the planet. Initially, she doesn't give this a lot of thought, but a few days later, she received a letter stating that her husband had died in combat. We then learn that Sang came by her house, asking her to return Aeris to the Shinra and revealing that they believe Aeris to be an ancient, a group of people from a time long past who apparently have the ability to speak to the planet. Now, the ancients are going to be pivotal to the overall plot later on, so while what we learn right now from Sang is true, the story is going to run much deeper than what we know right now. After spending some time with Marlene, Barrett comes downstairs and agrees to help Cloud and Tifa get into Shinra headquarters in order to save Aeris. We head back out and go through the wall market, picking up some batteries which we'll need from the local shop. We then use a wire to climb onto the upper plate of Midgar, where we see the Shinra building in the background, standing as a testament to the company's power. Now there's two ways to get into the Shinra building. The first one is to do a full frontal assault and just barge in through the front doors. This will alert the guards in the building, but once we reach a certain floor, the game will progress just like the other option. And the other option is to go into a side entrance of the Shinra building and run up the stairs and get to the highest floor as possible. I chose this one, not only to avoid the fighting, but because it gives some fun banter between Tifa, Barrett, and Cloud as they make their way up. Inside the Shinra building, we'll be met with a series of, I guess you could call them puzzles. For one, we'll have to move from one statue to the other without being caught by the guards. If we get caught, we'll have to try the puzzle over again, but besides that, there's really no other downside. Further on, we'll have to complete a model of Midgar with pieces from various chests hidden around rooms in the area. Putting a piece in will unlock another chest, and eventually we'll receive a key card for another floor when we complete the entire thing. Continuing on, we eavesdrop on an executive meeting with the upper management. A scientist named Hojo tells the executives and the president that he's been running tests on Aeris, and that he plans to breed her to make tougher test subjects. At least with this information, we know where we can find Aeris. We'll follow Hojo towards his laboratory, but on the way there, Cloud finds a metal pod and utters the word Genova. We check out the inside of the pod and see a strange headless creature inside. This triggers Cloud to have another episode, grasping his head and mentioning Jenova and Sephiroth. This shows a relation between the two, which is going to be very important later on. We follow Hojo until he finally reaches his experiment room. Aeris is stuck inside of a giant glass cell and Hojo summons a creature up from the lift. It seems like this creature is about to attack, so Barrett does what he does best and loads a hail of bullets towards the cell. This sends Hojo into a blind panic as he doesn't know what's happening to the creature and Aeris, so he opens up the cell. The creature jumps out and attacks Hojo, giving Aeris the chance to get out of it. However, the lift inside the cell suddenly starts moving again, and will be forced into a boss battle with one of Hojo's other experiments, sample H0512. There's no real storyline for this monster, he mainly exists as a distraction so we don't have our attention on Hojo for the time being. During the battle, we'll have to fight both the main body and 3 smaller creatures. They're of no importance though, so the best thing to do would be to focus on the main body and before long, it'll go down. In the meanwhile, Hojo's run off during the battle and we decide that this might be the best time to escape Shinra headquarters before more guards show up. We'll make our way towards the nearest elevator, but Rude, one of the Turks and a co-worker of Reno, the Turk that we saw earlier, shows up and captures us. The Turks then bring us towards the president, who tells us that they need Aeris because she's the last known surviving ancient, and they apparently need her to guide Shinra to the Promised Land, a place filled with so much Mako energy that they would be able to build a new version of Midgar there called Neo Midgar. Eventually, the president has had enough, and Rude wants to escort us to our cells. Barrett makes a last attempt to attack the president, but Rude drags him away. We're then brought to our cells. We're able to talk to the others, leading to Tifa finding out that Aeris hired Cloud in return for a date. Eventually, we decide to go to sleep, as there's nothing more that we can do in the cell. However, in the middle of the night, we wake up to find the cell doors open, and the guards murdered. One by one, we release our team from their cells and explore to find out what happened. All the while, Trail of Blood is creating a marvelously creepy atmosphere by playing in the background. We head towards the freight elevator again, which we used to get to Hojo's lab, but on the way there, we walk past the container which held Jenova, a trail of blood leading towards the elevator as well. We follow the trail until we reach the Shinra president's office. However, when we get there, we realize that the president is dead, a sword sticking out of his back as he's slumped over his desk. From behind one of the pillars in the office, Palmer shows up and tries to escape. We grab hold of him, and Palmer says that it was Sephiroth who killed the president. Obviously, we don't believe him, as Sephiroth is supposed to be dead for years now, but he states again he saw him with his own eyes. Palmer apparently listened in as Sephiroth talked to the president, and apparently overheard him saying that he will not let the Shinra have the Promised Land before killing him. Our conversation is suddenly interrupted by an approaching helicopter, and Barrett lets out that he forgot about Rufus, President Shinra's son. We head outside and confront Rufus, who apparently is unfazed by his father's death, instead seeing it as himself rising through the ranks and finally becoming the president of Shinra himself. We decide to split up the party. Everyone else is going to be heading downstairs while Cloud stays to confront Rufus. Here, we take control of Aeris, Barrett, and Red 13, making our way down from level to level to get down to the ground floor in an attempt to escape. However, when we get to the elevator, we'll have to fight a boss battle with this alternative party. This boss battle is against the 100 Gunner, and it actually has 3 separate phases. If we had Cloud, I'm sure the battle would have been much easier, as he and Tifa at this point hold the most of our powerful materia. But it's still fairly doable, with Aeris acting as the de facto healer of the group. During the battle, it's impossible to hit the 100 Gunner with close range attacks, making Barrett a needed character during this encounter. Seeing as it's a mechanical enemy, bolt magic also works wonders. After defeating the 100 Gunner, we'll leave Aeris and the rest behind, and we switch our focus to Cloud as he confronts Rufus. Rufus asks us why we want to fight him, and Cloud says we can't let him have the Promised Land. Rufus then drops another great bit of information by saying that Sephiroth is actually an ancient before confronting us. For this battle, we'll not only be facing Rufus but also his feline monster friend. While doing this battle, it's important to take the monster out first, as it has the possibility to cast Protect Magic on Rufus, making him able to tank far more of our hits than needed. Rufus does a mean amount of damage with his shotgun, and it's imperative to keep our health up during this encounter. In time though, the battle is left unfinished. Rufus will decide that he's had enough and he's going to escape by grabbing onto his helicopter. After the confrontation is done, we're going to head downstairs, meeting up with Tifa while we try and join with the other group. We switch over to the other party who try to escape through the front door. However, it turns out that the building is completely surrounded by Shinra forces. It seems like we'll surely die before Tifa comes running downstairs and tells us to follow her, saying that Cloud is already on his way. We then see one of the most badass shots in the game as Cloud rides down the stairs on a motorcycle while the rest of the group manages to steal a truck from one of the exhibits in the building. Cloud then pulls a badass move and breaks through one of the windows to get to the highway below, the team following him in the truck. We're then brought into a minigame. We'll need to control the bike and make our way across the highway while Shinra forces follow us on motorcycles as well. The team in the truck is defenseless and it's up to us to stop the enemy by hitting them with the Buster Sword. Now, I remember that with a controller this section was far easier. The button placement on a keyboard doesn't really lend itself perfectly for a section like this, but the segment isn't too difficult. It's just a shame that the control scheme forces you to take a very awkward hand position on the keyboard to actually work, making controlling the motorcycle a chore. Once we reach the end of the highway, we're not out of the woods yet. We'll have one more enemy to go through before we finally escape both the Shinra and Midgar itself. Now the next enemy we're going to face is the Motor Ball. This machine uses a lot of fire-based attacks that can damage our entire party. Luckily for us, we do have full control of our original party again, including our materia. Motor Ball has an attack called the Rolling Fire attack, which does a mean bit of damage, but it does have the added benefit of filling up our limit break meters extremely fast. Being a machine, the thing also has a weakness to bolt magic, making it a simple matter of keeping the team healed up as best as possible while we use our strongest moves against them. Eventually, it will fall and we're no longer being chased by anyone. The team stands near the end of the uncompleted highway and Barrett asks, "What do we do now?" Cloud is determined to stop Sephiroth and the rest of the team have their own reasons for joining him on the journey. The team decides that Cloud will be the leader, and this gives us the chance to finally decide on which party setup we'd like to go with. For now, I'm going to stick to Barrett and Tifa since they are the ones that I'm most familiar with. This is also the time that we venture out into the world map. Now, anyone who's familiar with the older Final Fantasy series is well acquainted with these. Unfortunately, Square did away with the traditional world map or overworld starting from Final Fantasy X, instead opting for a more streamlined approach by making every map link to the other or having an interactive map where you're able to just select the location you want to go to. However, the original iterations of the world maps have their own charms. They give a certain scope of grandeur to the game, allowing your mind to imagine how big the actual world of the game must be. I kind of miss not having overworlds anymore, and I'd like to see them return at some point. On the overworld, we'll find small renditions of locations that we can go to. In between, we can run all over the map where we run into random encounters with monsters. A nice added feature is that I noticed that the location of the battle screen actually changes depending on where you are at that time. If you're just walking over a grassy field, the field will be the arena where you fight off the monsters, while if you walk into a forest, the background will be that of the forest. Is it very special? No, but it's something that I liked about the game. It's these little additions that just give it a little bit of extra charm because it took extra time and effort to make it so. Anyway, enough fanboying about the overworld. Cloud and the group have a new location that we need to go to. We're going to be heading for the town of Kalm. From the overworld, we'll head into Kalm. The group goes towards the inn, and it is there that they request Cloud that he gives more of an explanation about what he knows about Sephiroth. We'll head towards one of the rooms, and it is there that Cloud begins to tell everyone what he remembers. 5 years ago, according to Cloud, he was a rookie and soldier. He idolized Sephiroth. We get into a flashback of both of them in a van on their way to the town of Nibelheim, Cloud's hometown. Apparently, at that time, the local Mako reactor was acting up, and the energy that it gave off was increasing monster activity in the area. Cloud was excited about receiving some new materia to try out, and Sephiroth tries to calm him down before the van suddenly stops and the group is attacked by monsters. Now, the scene in the van might be the first part where you notice that something is off about Cloud. Although we've only seen small snippets of him from when he was young, he's acting a lot different from his usual stoic self. And this strange behavior will be explained the further we get into the story. In the encounter with the monsters, the game does an amazing job of showing off how strong Sephiroth is at this time in comparison to us. While in combat, Cloud is barely able to stay alive while Sephiroth easily dispatches enemies, doing damage numbers that equal well into the thousands. And it's this small tidbit showcasing Sephiroth as way above us in power, which actually cements him as a powerful character. We know that 5 years ago he had the power that far outshone ours, even though we're supposedly on the same rank of soldier by this time. If you compare the damage numbers he does in comparison to us now, it shows us how much room we still have left to grow before we'd even stand a chance against him. By the time the team arrives, Sephiroth determines that it's too late to make the trip to the reactor, so the plan is to spend the night at the inn and head out first thing in the morning. Since we have some free time now, Sephiroth gives Cloud the permission to go see his family and friends since he's in town. During this time, we visit Tifa's house, where you actually have the option to make some questionable choices, like going through Tifa's underwear drawer. In any case, Tifa is apparently not at home, so we'll decide to go to Cloud's home to visit his mom. Cloud's memories of his mom are vague, they're fragmented, shown by the short bits of static in between the recollections of him and his mom's conversations. From what we can tell, she's a bit of a doting mother, thinking that the girls can't get enough of Cloud, and telling him to get a girlfriend that he can settle down with. The day after, Cloud is surprised when he finds out that Tifa is actually the one who's going to guide us up the mountain to get to the reactor. There's also an event that happens in the meantime. It's going to seem very insignificant now, but it actually has a big impact on the story later on. Right before the group is supposed to head up the mountain path, one of the villagers asks them if they want to take a picture to commemorate the occasion. And it's this picture, this small little thing, that is going to be so integral later on to the story. So keep this one in mind for when we get there. We then see everyone heading up the mountain path until we reach a rope bridge. The bridge is apparently unstable and collapses, leading to the loss of one of the supporting Shinra soldiers. Well, at least we presume he's dead. He's never mentioned again, and the team never even bothers to go search for it. Luckily for us, we have another way to make it to the other side without the bridge. It turns out that the mountains are connected by a cave system, allowing us to travel through them to make it to the reactor. As we make our way through the cave system, we stop to wonder at the strange color of the cave walls. Clearly more informed than the rest of the group, Sephiroth explains that the strange color is because of the abundance of Mako energy in the area, which is probably why the reactor was built there in the first place. Further into the cave, we see a rare sight, a natural Mako fountain. When large amounts of Mako collect in an area, they can sometimes form these pools and fountains of Mako energy. Cloud takes this chance to try and get some explanation about materia and why it allows us to use magic whenever we equip it. Apparently, the knowledge and wisdom of the ancients is inside the materia. This means that anyone that equips it can tap into that knowledge and use it to cast magic. On hearing Cloud call it magic, Sephiroth can't help but recall his own experience when he was being taught about materia. He was once scolded by a scientist to never use such unscientific terms as mysterious power. Technically, he shouldn't even be calling it magic. That scientist was Dr. Hojo of Shinra. Following this scene, we eventually make it to the old Mako reactor. Unfortunately for Tifa, she has to stay outside as the reactor is for Shinra employees only. Inside, the way into the reactor is probably every OSHA auditor's nightmare. But we eventually make it to what Sephiroth thinks is the source of the problem when we discover a locked door labeled Jenova in the back of a room full of strange glowing pods. Apparently, one of the pods is leaking. Sephiroth is curious why it broke in the first place. He pulls himself up to the viewing window and takes a look inside of the pod. Normally, this unit would be used to condense and freeze Mako energy, essentially creating materia. However, this pod holds something else, something far more dark. Inside the pod is a person, leading to them being exposed to an insane amount of Mako energy, essentially turning them into a monster. Sephiroth recognizes this as Professor Hojo's handiwork, and it's from this point that something changes inside of him. He knows his mom's name is Jenova, and due to him being different, he begins to suspect that this might be the way that he came into existence. And it's upon this realization that Sephiroth has a meltdown. He starts swinging his sword around wildly, cursing Hojo at the same time. At the same time, one of the pods opens and the creature inside falls out. The scene ends here, and we're treated to Cloud explaining to the party what happened after Sephiroth apparently retreated from everyone in the village, even his own team, holding himself up in the abandoned Shinra mansion in town. We go to investigate and find a hidden entrance that leads to a cellar. Inside, we discover a hidden library with Sephiroth inside. He's reading all of the books, trying to find out anything about what Shinra was doing, and quite possibly what they're still doing to this day. Cloud tries to approach him, trying to connect with Sephiroth in any way, but all Sephiroth wants is to be left alone. And that's what people did. Everyone just let him do things at his own pace. And according to what Cloud tells us, he stayed in that library for days. But eventually, Sephiroth couldn't be ignored anymore. Cloud heads down again a few days later and tries to talk with him in any way. But Sephiroth says he doesn't want the help of a traitor. And I think this needs some explanation. Sephiroth isn't referring to Cloud personally. Instead, he's referring to Cloud's entire ancestry. Long ago, people known as the Cetra, who we now know as the Ancients, traveled around in search of the Promised Land. Eventually, there were those who were no longer willing to continue the search. They wanted to settle down and lead simple lives rather than continue chasing after something that could possibly not even exist. And it's these people that would form the basis for the humanoid characters that we see in Final Fantasy VII. The Cetra that did decide to continue the journey had to deal with another disaster. Sephiroth doesn't go into details about what it was, but he explains that Cloud's ancestors only survived because they decided to hide, leaving the other Cetra to deal with the disaster and presumably perish. According to Sephiroth, Jenova is one of the Ancients who initially wanted to continue the journey, and Shinra's Jenova project is an attempt to create beings who would be able to emulate the power of these people, enabling them to find the Promised Land. Sephiroth believes that he is the result of this project, and he has a new mission now, going to the Promised Land with his mother. He walks out of the basement, presumably going towards the Mako reactor to retrieve Jenova. We follow him, and when we finally make it out of the mansion and back into Nibelheim, we're treated with what might possibly be the most iconic scene of the game. Sephiroth has gone completely off the deep end, setting fire to Nibelheim. We can search around the houses for survivors, including Cloud's own house, but it's not going to make a difference. Almost everyone, including Cloud's mother, died that night. As Cloud continues looking around the ruins of his hometown, he sees Sephiroth standing near the mansion, killing anyone that comes near him. Sephiroth looks right at him, smiling before he turns around and walks into the flames. He chases him, following him all the way to the Mako reactor. Inside, we find out that Tifa and her father managed to make it ahead of us and have already confronted Sephiroth. The exact scene that we saw earlier in the game when we were trying to destroy the number 5 Mako reactor. Tifa takes the sword that Sephiroth left behind after he attacked her dad and runs after him. When we head after her and end up back in the pod room, we see her trying to attack Sephiroth as he tries to get into the Genova room. He overpowers her and uses his sword to slash her, leading to her falling down the stairs dramatically. After Sephiroth heads into the room, we go to Tifa to make sure she's still alive. Luckily, she is, otherwise we'd have a time paradox on our hands. We lay her down against one of the pods before we head after Sephiroth and encounter him in the Genova room. Inside, we see Sephiroth talking to what seems to be a metal angelic form. It's clear that he's gone completely off the deep end, claiming that together they should take back the planet. Cloud confronts Sephiroth about what he did to Nibelheim, but he doesn't respond. Instead, he insists that the traitors have returned. Slowly, Sephiroth approaches what we think is Genova before he rips the metal body in half, revealing a hidden tube with a body inside. This is the real Genova. Cloud and Sephiroth are just about to face off. The camera keeps shifting back and forth between the two before the story abruptly stops. Obviously, more happened after this, but Cloud can't remember any of it. By Cloud's own admission, he's sure he wasn't strong enough to actually have killed Sephiroth. However, official records after the incident did state that he was dead. So while the story did explain what happened to Cloud, it also brought with it more questions. Sephiroth could have easily killed Cloud during their fight, but he didn't, and nobody knows why. It also doesn't explain why Genova's headless body was in the Shinra building and where it went to. Now, while this story doesn't give us all the answers, Sephiroth has to still be alive, and both him and Shinra are after the Promised Land. It's up to us to stop them. We then leave Kalm, and after a stop at the nearby Chocobo Ranch, we follow Sephiroth's sightings into the nearby marshlands, where we find a giant serpent on top of a stake. Cloud knows this must have been Sephiroth. Eventually, we find out that Sephiroth is headed towards a Shinra base called Junon, and we'll make that our next destination. When we finally reach Junon, we'll initially be unable to go anywhere except explore the small town. When we head to the beachside, we'll see a small girl called Priscilla who's playing with a dolphin. She's initially scared of us, thinking that we're members of Shinra. Suddenly, a massive sea creature shows up, and Priscilla runs into the sea to protect her dolphin friend. And this brings us into the battle with an enemy called the Bottom Swell, and he's technically using the same strategy as Reno, as he'll be able to lock one of our characters out of combat by trapping them inside of a bubble. The difference is this time that instead of attacking with basic attacks, we can only burst the bubbles by using magic attacks. To make matters worse, the party member that is trapped inside of the bubble will gradually lose health because they don't have any air inside. After combat, Priscilla will be on the beach, knocked out cold and not breathing. We'll have to perform CPR on her in a minigame that basically involves nothing more than pressing a key once to inhale and once more to give her air. After she gains consciousness, her grandfather takes her back home and will stay the night in one of the houses so we can rest up after the battle, the villagers allowing us to stay as a gesture for saving her. While we're asleep, Cloud has a dream. A voice speaks to him and talks about the events in Nibelheim. The voice asks Cloud why he wasn't able to see Tifa during the incident, yet this doesn't make any sense. We did see Tifa during the events. Or did we? Hold on to your seats on that one, because this story is going to take a while. The next day, we meet Priscilla again and we'll be able to make it to Junon Harbor by jumping on top of a structure with the help of the dolphin. Inside, we'll find out that Junon is holding a celebration in honor of Rufus becoming the new Shinra president. Cloud infiltrates the soldiers that are leading the celebration. I think Cloud wearing a soldier uniform is probably what lets him get into the base so easily. He then trains with the infantrymen to march as a tribute to Rufus. This leads to some minigames where we have to practice poses by means of pressing the right button at the right time, even leading to some fun comments from the TV crew depending on how well or how badly we perform during the march. At the end of the march, there's one more demonstration for Rufus before he gets on a boat, and if we perform well enough, Heidegger even gives us an HP plus materia, which should come in handy. Rufus then gets onto the boat and tells Heidegger to stop his stupid laugh. This is our chance, as the soldiers go on to their own business. We'll get onto the boat and stow away for now as we make the trip to the other landmass. Soon after, we'll see that the rest of the team managed to sneak aboard as well. We'll spy on Rufus and Heidegger on the bridge, Barrett barely able to keep his calm as they're so close that he just wants to shoot them right now in an effort to avenge the deaths of his team back in Midgar. However, an alarm goes off, stating that a stowaway was found. We check up with the rest of the team, but it turns out that everyone is here. This could mean only one thing. The stowaway has to be Sephiroth. When we go below deck, it's eerily quiet. Most of the crew members are either missing or wounded on the floor. One of the infantrymen says that there is a mysterious character in the engine room. Inside the engine room, we find a lone officer, but he falls over, seemingly dead. Suddenly a voice sounds out and Sephiroth comes out of the floor and says that the time has come before he flies off, leaving a piece of something behind that suddenly attacks us. This is Jenova Birth, seemingly only a piece of the Jenova that we saw in the Shinra building back in Midgar, and it is one of the more challenging boss battles this early in the game. Jenova can dish out a mean amount of damage, but the most dangerous thing she can do is use stop magic, which essentially takes a party member out of the battle unless we can dispel the status. If you do happen to die at Jenova, like I did, not all hope is lost. The crewmen upstairs can act as an inn and replenish our magic and health points for a fee so we can level up below deck if we want to. Just don't engage the officer in the engine room before you're ready. After the battle with Jenova, the group finally disembarks in Costa del Sol and decides to follow the rumors of the black-suited man to the town of North Corel, or Corel. I'm not completely sure on that one. Once there, we find out that this is Barrett's hometown and Barrett is shunned by the community, and we're gonna find out why. When Barrett lived in Corel, the town's industry depended on its coal mining. However, times weren't that great for coal, probably because of the rise of delivering power through Mako energy being a lot less labor intensive. Shinra apparently had the same idea and approached the people of Corel to stop mining coal and instead let them install a Mako reactor near their town. Dine, one of the leaders of the town, initially says no, but Barrett and some of the others apparently talk him into it, seeing no other way to support their livelihood in the time of Mako. Eventually, Dine agrees and Shinra apparently goes ahead with building the reactor. However, later, when Dine and Barrett are out of town, Shinra apparently attacks, destroying the entire mining town. Now in Final Fantasy VII itself, it's kind of unclear why Shinra did this. There's some talk about an explosion at the reactor, which apparently, according to Shinra, was because of a faction of villagers who didn't want the Mako reactor to be built. There's a little bit more explanation about this in another game called Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII, but I'm gonna leave that here for now. We head to a nearby amusement park named Gold Saucer to look for more information, and we meet a strange creature named, and I'm gonna catch flack for this name, Kate Sith. Now let me explain real quick. Kate Sith is the name that I'm gonna use. Before the time of the internet, there was a lot of debate about what the name was. Cat She, Cat Sith. Square came out with a tweet, I think, that said that the name was Kate Sith. So that's what I'm gonna be using for now. Kate Sith joins our team, and during our time in Gold Saucer, we find out about a string of murders that's taking place. Our initial response is, of course, that Sephiroth is responsible for this, but when we eventually make our way to the scene of the crime and we investigate the bodies, it tells us that the victims were shot, and Barrett is the prime suspect. The owner of Gold Saucer, and I swear I'm trying not to make a JoJo reference out of this because we didn't expect him, is a man called Dio. He sees us around the bodies in the room and comes to the conclusion that we're the ones to blame. We make an attempt to run from him, but we're caught by his security robots. Dio punishes us by sending us down to Coral Prison, which I presume is located in the desert outside of Gold Saucer. When we find Barrett in one of the houses inside of Coral Prison, he's on edge, and he explains more of his backstory from back in the town. When Dine and him returned to the town, they were cornered by Shinra troops. In the assault, Dine fell off of a cliff, but Barrett managed to grab hold of his arm at the last second. Unfortunately, the story didn't have a happy ending. The infantrymen shot at the duo, and in the firefight, both of them were injured, each losing an arm in the process. Now, this story explains how Barrett got his gun grafted into his arm, but as we find out, Barrett wasn't the only one who got the surgery. Dine is apparently still alive, and it turns out that he got the same operation as well. This leads to Barrett going on a quest for answers, trying to find out more about his long-lost friend. We find Dine in the outskirts of the prison, angered over the events that took place a few years ago. Dine tells us that he was indeed the one who murdered the employees. When Barrett reveals that Marlene, who is actually Dine's daughter, who Barrett took in and raised as his own, is still alive, Dine, completely gone at this point, tells Barrett that he wants to go to Marlene and take her back to her mother, effectively stating he wants to kill his own daughter. Barrett warns everyone to stay away, and we engage Dine in combat. For this battle, we'll only have control of Barrett, and Dine is a strong enemy at this point. His attacks do insane amount of damage, and it's suggested if you're playing through the game yourself to always make sure that Barrett has a restore materia slotted at this time so you can heal yourself. After the battle, Dine has given up. He tells Barrett that there's no way that he can go with him to Midgar to see Marlene, as he feels his hands are too stained with blood to carry her. Dine limps towards the edge of the cliff they're standing on, and he jumps off, falling to his death. Barrett is just shook by this. Once again, he's lost one of his closest friends. He falls to his knees and says that he doesn't have the right to be with Marlene either, since his hands are stained with blood as well. A little while later, Barrett threatens several people at the prison to allow us to have a chance of freedom by taking part in the chocobo races. A man named Mr. Coates relents, and he'll let us give it a try. And this brings us to yet another minigame, chocobo racing. And oh god, do I dislike chocobo racing. There's a whole subsection of the game where you can catch your own chocobo, race with it, breed it to get better chocobos, etc. But I so wholly dislike it that I only spent time on this in this one story segment where you need to do it, and then I never looked back at it ever again. Now, some people might really like chocobo racing, and honestly, it might just be me not understanding the racing system all that well, but it never clicked with me. In any case, after we win the race, we're set free, allowing us to continue on our journey. Not only that, we also receive a message from Dio saying that he recently met Sephiroth and heard that he was heading towards the village of Gongaga. To top it all off, we even get a buggy with which we can cross shallow waters, allowing us to travel across more places on the world map. On our way to Gongaga, we can meet a young mysterious ninja whenever we go through a forest area on the overmap. She can attack us, and after we knock her out, we have to answer a few questions in order to get her to join the party. This is going to be our new party member, Yuffie. Now, getting Yuffie is completely optional. We don't actually need her to finish the game, but her being in the party does open up optional side quests, which we'll get into later on. I didn't use her all that much as her kit just doesn't work for me. As we said, the next stop is Gongaga. Now at first glance, Gongaga seems to be a small little village of no importance, but this little town actually holds quite a bit of history to the Final Fantasy VII mythos as a whole, but its story will become far more clear the further we progress through the game. The town was decimated because of the nearby Mako reactor. It apparently exploded about 3 years before the beginning of the game, taking a lot of innocent lives in the process. When we make our way into one of the homes, we find a couple who recognize the glow in Cloud's eyes, realizing that he used to be in Soldier. It turns out that their son, a young man named Zack, was also a member of Soldier, but he left home about 10 years ago and they haven't heard from him in years. The mentioning of his name seems to trigger something within Tifa, making her say his name. Zack's mother notes that about 6 years ago he wrote to them saying that he got a girlfriend, and she wants to know if it might have been Tifa. This apparently makes Tifa uncomfortable, and she walks out of the couple's home. We follow her, and for some reason she seems on edge, deflecting any knowledge of her knowing Zack. Now, this is not going to be the last time when the name Zack is going to be of some importance to the story, and it's going to make a lot more sense later on. With Gongaga done, we set out for Cosmo Canyon. Once there, Red 13 reveals that this is his home, and the man who runs the observatory, Bugenhagen, is his grandfather. He also reveals that his real name is not Red 13, but it's Nanaki. Inside the observatory, Red and his grandfather are reunited. Red tells Cloud and the others that his race were the protectors of the canyon, but his father ran away years ago when they were attacked by a neighboring tribe. This made Red harbor a lot of repressed anger for his father. He feels that he failed both the tribe and his son. Bugenhagen reveals a large model of the planet and explains the concept of the life stream to us. The life stream contains the essence of the planet and the memories, emotions, and knowledge of all the people who have lived on it. Portions of the life stream are believed to be used to create new life on the planet, and the energy of a person returns to the planet when they die, bringing with it the emotions, memories, and knowledge that they got when they were alive. Now, judging from the animation, it seems like the life stream concept believes in reincarnation. The death of a person would mean their energy would return to the planet to then be recycled for the life of a new person or something else entirely. And this makes the Mako reactors even more sinister. It means that Midgar is actively being powered by the souls and memories of the dead, effectively stopping them from being reincarnated, as they're being used for energy. The life stream also serves another purpose though. It is meant to heal the planet whenever it is injured by a cataclysmic event, and this is going to be very important later on when we get to that part of the story. Later on, after the entire presentation, the entire group is sitting around a campfire in Cosmo Canyon. Red's grandfather shows up and confronts him about his thoughts on his father. Red still believes his father was a coward who ran away when the neighboring tribe attacked, and Bugenhagen takes us to a cave as he tells us he wants to show us something. We enter and fight our way through the cave, eventually ending up at a boss fight, where we fight the lingering souls of the enemies that died there long ago. When we finally defeat the creature, we're brought to the final area in the cave where we find a stone figure of one of Red's race. It turns out that this is his father, and instead of running off like Red thought, he actually fought to keep the inhabitants of Cosmo Canyon safe, while the poison that he was struck with from his enemy's weapons slowly turned him into stone. In a final, and I have to say heart-wrenching scene, Red howls up to the moon, and the figure actually sheds tears, showing that even though he's turned into a statue, it's likely that Red's father is still alive in there somewhere. Afterwards, we think about what implications this has on us for a group. This has to be the end of Red's travels. However, Bugenhagen tells Red to continue traveling with us, and we set out for Nibelheim, Cloud and Tifa's hometown. Once we reach Nibelheim, Cloud and Tifa are shocked to see that the town is apparently completely undamaged. Now, if it had been rebuilt in the meantime, that would make sense, but none of the town people seem to know neither Tifa or Cloud, which is weird to say the least. Furthermore, in the town we also find some of the black-cloaked figures who mention something called a reunion. The townspeople also don't seem to mind the black-cloaked figures around. Eventually, one of the cloaks tells us that Sephiroth wants to speak with us inside of the Shinra mansion. When we reach the same library space that we found Sephiroth in during the flashback in Kalm, he once again doesn't make any sense, saying that Jenova is going to be at the reunion, and that she's going to become a calamity from the skies. Cloud is equally as confused and tells Sephiroth to be clear, but instead, Sephiroth tells him that he doesn't have the right to participate in the reunion. However, if we want to follow him, he says that he's going to head north of Mount Nibel, and that we can follow him if we want. He then flies off. And this scene is a bit weird. Sephiroth is powerful, so he shouldn't have any trouble to finish us off right here and now, but instead it's like he's guiding us somewhere, which in my mind means he has a use for us in some way or another. We're not fully done in the Shinra mansion just yet, as we have the possibility to recruit another character to the team. Inside the mansion is a safe, and throughout the building we'll find several clues as to what its combination is. When we finally enter the combination, the safe will open, revealing not only a materia, but immediately putting us into combat with a creature known as the Lost Number. This creature attacks us with both physical and magical attacks, and later on in the battle, there's a mechanic that, even in this playthrough, after having beaten this guy so many times before, led me to the game over screen. The Lost Number is no joke. Around this time, a player is probably within the mid-level 20s, and for this fight, the boss is definitely a challenge. Lost Number boasts a hefty 7,000 hit points and hits like a truck with some of his attacks. And the mechanic that I was talking about works as follows. Around the midpoint of the fight, the boss splits up and will start to use either magic or physical attacks based on the last attack we used to get him to mid-health. If we used physical attacks, he will assume a form which is strong to physical attacks, while if we got him to this point with magical attacks, he'll have a form which is strong to magic attacks. Both forms can do a mean amount of damage, but the physical form has an attack which does so much damage that he can take out a character in one hit, even if you did the regular leveling on the world map. To make it easier on ourselves, we'll use magic to take him down halfway, and then proceed to pummel him with limit breaks and basic attacks. After he's dead, we'll gain a summon materia which contains Odin, and an item called Cosmo Memory. Lastly, we'll receive a key. We'll head downstairs again, near to the room where we encountered Sephiroth. To the side is another door which would normally be closed, but we can now open it using the key that we got from the fight with Lost Number. Inside the room is a coffin, and when we open it up there's a man inside. He initially tells us to leave him alone, but once we mention Sephiroth, he seems to become more interested in what we have to say. Eventually though, he closes the coffin once more, and there is nothing else that we can do but walk back towards the entrance of Shinra Manor. However, before we can go up the stairs, the man from the coffin appears and tells us that he wants to join us if we're chasing Sephiroth. This is Vincent Valentine, and as we'll find out later in the story, his background is actually heavily connected to the overall narrative of Final Fantasy VII's story. Vincent is another gun user, and I mainly replaced Barrett with him because I just enjoy that edgy vampire-esque aesthetic. An interesting thing about Vincent is his limit break. Where most of the limit breaks for our characters have consisted of either dealing a lot of damage or healing up the entire party, Vincent's limit break changes his form to that of a werewolf vampire-esque monster called the Galleon Beast. After we use his limit break, we essentially lose control of the character as he'll attack with different moves automatically. Throughout the course of the game, we'll level up his limit break just like the others, and they'll give him access to various other monster forms, which all have their ups and downs. Important to note is that after Vincent has used this limit break, his health refills as his limit is treated as a separate character. After battle is done, his health will also be replenished back to full. His limit break is handy, but it depends on your playstyle. The regenerating health bit is a very good plus, but losing control of the character means that even if an enemy, for example, is strong against fire, it won't stop Vincent from using fire-based attacks on them. In any case, we're done in Nibelheim for now. It's time to head to our next destination. We're going off to Rocket Town. We eventually find Rocket Town further up in the continent, and it's named so for, well, the rocket that's slumped over in the town. We meet Sid and Shira. Sid was apparently once the pilot for the rocket, working for Shinra's space program. However, when the launch was happening, Shira, a scientist and apparently also one of the engineers for the machine, remained to fix an oxygen tank that she thought was faulty. Now, she didn't just do this after hours. She was actively still repairing this thing during the launch. And if Cid had continued the launch, Shira would have been burned alive, so he stopped it at the last second to save her life. Ever since then, Shira's been trying to make it up to Cid. His treatment of her is demeaning to say the least, and it actively did not make me like Cid in the beginning. He's constantly throwing insults at her and demands stuff from her, expecting to get it done right away. Eventually, we find out from Cid that Rufus and his group are headed to Rocket Town as well. Cid wants to talk to Rufus in order to get another chance at taking off in the rocket so he can fulfill his lifelong dream of going to space. He's under the impression that that is what Rufus is here for, in an effort to reboot the space program. He then becomes frustrated with the Shinra when they show up and all they want is Cid's plane, the tiny Bronco, the exact thing that we need right now as well. While Cid is talking to Rufus, Shira shows up and tells us that Palmer, one of the Shinra executives, is at that plane right now and is trying to take off with it while Cid is talking. We head to the tiny Bronco and confront Palmer. It throws us into a sort of semi-boss fight. It's not very challenging. Palmer will use his gun to shoot at us a few times, but there is a funny bit at the end of the battle where Palmer is taunting us but doesn't notice that the tiny Bronco is starting up in the background before he gets run over. We then take off in the plane, trying to get away with it before the Shinra troops get to us. However, when we fly over, they open fire and unfortunately hit the tiny Bronco. Cid manages to make it onto the plane at the last moment, effectively joining the party. However, because the tiny Bronco was hit, it is now unable to fly anymore. This turns the plane into a somewhat glorified boat. It'll give us some more freedom of movement than the buggy we got from Gold Saucer, but it's still a shame that we can't use it to fly. Cid then tells us that he overheard Rufus go into a place called the Temple of the Ancients, but that he needed an item called the Keystone to access it. Now, here's where it gets a bit confusing. It's clear we're going to need the Keystone, but the game doesn't specifically tell us where to get it. It just tells us to get to land and get some information. If we check the map, we'll see that one of the closest places is Gold Saucer, so quite possibly we'll get some more information over there. Before we head to Gold Saucer though, we'll make a stop at Yuffie's hometown, Wutai. While we're on our way there, Yuffie starts acting slightly weird and we're suddenly attacked by Shinra troops who are in the area. However, during the battle, we notice that something is off. We're suddenly unable to use any magic summons and skills, and it isn't until after the battle that we notice that all of our materia is gone, along with Yuffie. We then realize that Yuffie must have run off with our materia, as that was what she was interested in when we met her. And this actually ties into Yuffie's story. As we find out later, Wutai was at one point engaged in a war with Midgar, or more clearly, they were in a war with Shinra. And for Yuffie, this will be very important, but I'll explain that in a bit. Now, the game doesn't give us explicit details regarding what happened during the Wutai War. This is something that would be delved into further during the course of Crisis Core, the prequel to Final Fantasy VII. Now, using only the information from the game, we can kind of put together that the war that we've heard about is presumably the one where Sephiroth gained his fame. In the end, Wutai lost the war with Midgar, and this has led to a disagreement with Yuffie and her father. After the war, Wutai has become more of a tourist location, and Yuffie doesn't like how her father seemingly has lost his drive to stand up to the Shinra. This explains, in turn, her drive to collect materia, as she wants to restore Wutai to its former glory and defeat the Shinra. She believes that only by acquiring as much materia as possible will Wutai have the chance to do so. In Wutai, we meet Reno, Rude, and Elena, who are enjoying their holiday, and after a bit of back and forth banter, Reno decides he's not going to attack us because they are on vacation. Our main point right now is to find Yuffie and get our materia back. We'll have to search through several places in the village, and eventually we'll have her cornered. Or we think so. Yet again, she manages to escape by trapping us in a steel cage. When we break out and follow her, we find out that Don Corneo has set up shop in Wutai, and he's kidnapped both Yuffie and Elena. When we make it outside, we find that Reno and Rude are already on their way to save Elena. We decide to put our differences aside for now, but the Turks make it absolutely clear to us that this will only be a temporary truce. When we get to Wutai's mountainside, we'll split up to look for Elena and Yuffie. We'll find them shackled to a stone face on the mountain, with Corneo gloating about which girl he wants this time. To protect himself from us, he'll send a monster called Raps at us. It's a dragon-esque monster that can dish out a lot of damage, but once again there's a small trick to beating him easily. By using Mind Blow, Barrett's second limit break, we can drain the monster of its magic points, making it unable to use its most powerful attacks, and essentially making this fight a cakewalk. After the battle, Corneo has one more trick up his sleeve though. He has a button which will make Elena and Yuffie fall to their demise if he pushes it. Essentially, this puts us into a stalemate. However, he didn't count on Reno and Rude showing up. Rude shows up from behind Corneo and throws something at him, making Corneo fall off the mountainside, hanging on for dear life. Reno then finishes him off by stepping on his hands, making him finally fall and presumably to his death. At least we think so. We never see him in the game ever again. There's still a bit of tension in the air after this, with both our group and the Turks facing off. But luckily, Reno and Rude still decide that today is their day off. Eventually, we'll get our materia back from Yuffie, albeit slotted in the completely wrong order, which we're gonna have to fix later on. She apologizes and goes on a rant about how she could have taken out Corneo by herself if she got the chance, but it's too late. We've already walked off though. But she follows us while she also gives us an MP absorbed materia. Now, there's an optional side quest left to do in Wutai if you want to. On the outskirts of Wutai, near Yuffie and Godo's house, is a tower called the Pagoda of the Five Mighty Gods. It's a place where warriors can prove their strength versus the people that inhabit the tower. Once we make our way inside, we can take the challenge, but only by using Yuffie. No other characters will be allowed to join into the battles. This means we'll need to switch up our materia and connect the strongest ones to Yuffie. The battles will be against Gorky, Shake, Chekhov, and Stanif, before we finally face off against the leader of the five gods, Yuffie's father, Godo. Godo is obviously the most challenging one of the bunch, but I wouldn't call this entire trial difficult. If you've leveled up Yuffie enough by this time, which honestly I didn't, I'm sure you can breeze through this fairly easily. After we defeat Godo, we'll get a bit of a father-daughter bonding time before we receive the All Creation, the item needed to learn Yuffie's final limit break. We also receive another summon materia, namely Leviathan. This summon is mostly based around water damage. I didn't feel a lot of use for it, so I didn't really use it during my playthrough. After we've done all this, we're finally finished in Wutai, and it's time to continue our quest. After Wutai, we make our way towards Gold Saucer. We find the keystone in the theme park as part of Dio's collection. He doesn't give it to us outright though. He wants us to provide him with some entertainment first by fighting in the Gold Saucer Battle Arena. In the arena, we'll only have Cloud for these battles, and I'll have to fight several of them back to back without taking a break in between. But I found that if you just equip him with some restore materia, it's quite easy. Dio gives us the keystone, and we decide to rest in Gold Saucer for the night. Now remember in the beginning, where I said that the way you treated characters during the course of the game would have consequences for a scene later on? This is the exact scene that I'm going to be talking about. Ever since we were in Midgar, we've had conversations where we could choose how to react towards our party members. Now, as I said before, these reactions would alter hidden values that the characters have. These in turn signify our friendship points. Initially, everyone starts off at a certain baseline, and the one with the highest amount of points will now join us on a nightly outing in Gold Saucer. It's possible to go out on this quote-unquote date with either Aeris, Tifa, Barrett, or Yuffie. For this playthrough, since I've mostly had Tifa in the party, it turned out to be her. We go on the date with Tifa and she's being a bit coy, trying to reveal while she has feelings for Cloud, she can't bring herself to say the actual words. But there's more behind her words though. Something she wants to say is not being said, and it's going to be a while before we discover what it is. However, soon after, the date is interrupted when we discover that the keystone is taken by Cait Sith. He turns out to be a Shinra spy. Cait Sith gives the item to a Shinra helicopter, but he still decides to stay with the group in an effort to atone for his actions and tells us how to find the temple. Now, I always thought this scene was a bit weird. The time when Cait Sith decides to stay with us cannot be more than only a few minutes after he gives away the keystone. So the party deciding to let him travel with us, I don't know, it seems a bit out of character. After Gold Saucer, we head towards the Temple of the Ancients, where we discover that the Turks have already gotten to the temple, but they were attacked by Sephiroth. Inside, one of the Turks, Tseng, is wounded. He tells us that Sephiroth told him that the Promised Land is not what Shinra thinks it is, and he gives us back the keystone. We continue further inside and we reach a large mural detailing the history of the Cetra, also known as the Ancients. Sephiroth appears and explains that he will use the Black Materia to summon Meteor, a powerful destruction magic. This magic would then in turn wound the planet, and as we found out earlier, this is going to trigger the life stream to try and mend it. Sephiroth wants to be at the center of this wound, taking the power of the life stream for himself. And it's at this point when something happens to Cloud. He begins acting somewhat funny, speaking in a weird way, almost like he's possessed. And while this might seem to come somewhat out of nowhere, take note that Cloud has had his odd moments throughout the story thus far. The voices he's been hearing now and again signify that something is off, but it's going to be a while before we learn the truth about what's happening to him. Going back to the temple, we find out that the Black Materia is actually the temple itself. To get it, we need to use a model inside the temple to shrink it down. But the mechanism is safeguarded by a trick to stop someone from taking the materia for themselves. Someone has to stay inside the temple and sacrifice themselves, solving the puzzle as the temple will shrink around them to form the materia. Initially, the team thinks that this will stop Sephiroth from taking the Black Materia until they realize that he can probably force someone to do it for him anyway. In the end, Cait Sith volunteers to create the materia, actually making a big scene out of leaving the party to sacrifice himself, possibly to make up for giving away the keystone earlier. And this scene is a bit painful to watch if you know what's about to happen after this. The team heads outside, and when we get to the edge of the temple, it changes into the Black Materia in a flash of dark light. Cloud and Aeris then head into the resulting crater to get the Black Materia to keep it away from Sephiroth. But then, Sephiroth shows up, and he makes Cloud hand over the Black Materia using a form of mind control. Now, a lot of things are going to be happening during this short scene, and I'll try to explain them as best as I can. Cloud suddenly starts attacking Aeris. A younger version of Cloud appears behind him and is forced to watch it happen while the rest of the party tries to stop him. During this, a second Cait Sith happens to come in and casually say that he's Cait Sith number 2, making the scene before this absolutely pointless to me in the sense of emotionally investing in him as a character. In the end, Cloud passes out after he's done attacking Aeris. He then has a dream, and he sees Aeris walking through a forest. She tells him she's going to go to the city of the Ancients, and as one of the remaining Ancients, she's going to face Sephiroth alone. She then runs off into the distance, with Cloud unable to follow her as he seems to be frozen in place. Cloud then wakes up at Gongaga village, where the party apparently took him after his episode. Aeris is actually missing, meaning the dream probably wasn't a dream at all. Cloud explains that Aeris has gone to the city of the Ancients, and will have to follow her in order to help. And it's during this conversation with the team that Cloud is going through a bit of a personal crisis. He's afraid that if he gets near Sephiroth again, he'll lose control, and in turn might hurt someone else this time. Now let me lift the veil a little bit and explain that Sephiroth's ability to control Cloud isn't just simple plot convenience. There's actually a whole story woven behind this event, and it will become a lot more clear to us later on. Unfortunately for us, we're not going to be able to just go to the City of the Ancients and head in. We'll need an item called the Lunar Harp before we can get to the city. We'll have to hop into the tiny Bronco and make our way north to a place called Bone Village. Inside Bone Village, we'll have to do, I guess you could call this a minigame. There's a team of excavators who are willing to help us search for the Lunar Harp in return for payment. This puts us into a small sequence where we'll have to locate the Lunar Harp through echolocation. After we retrieve the Lunar Harp, we're able to make our way through the forest, which we saw in Cloud's dream, and get to the City of the Ancients, snatching up a well-hidden summon materia on the way there. Once we're inside, we're going to explore the seemingly abandoned City of the Ancients. Try as we might, we're not going to find Aeris anytime soon. We make our way to what seems to be an abandoned shack where we're able to get some rest. However, Cloud wakes up in the middle of the night and calls the others. Something is wrong, and we need to head back to the city. Inside, we'll find that the entrance to the city opens at night. We eventually discover Aeris praying, and we try to make our way over to her. However, when we do, Cloud's fear becomes a reality. Sephiroth's mind control seems to take over once again, and it forces us, the player, to watch helplessly as no matter what buttons we press, Cloud is getting closer to Aeris, seemingly in an effort to kill her, as he's about to bring his sword down on her. Now, before we start talking about the next scene, there is no way that I cannot talk about it. It is one of the most iconic parts of the game, and to this day, it's one of the most talked about scenes in the game. What really seems to get people, at a time where everyone in the known world with an internet connection knows it's going to happen, it can still hit you somewhat unexpected. This is also a big moment for Cloud's development. Cloud manages to overpower what seems to be his programming. He manages to prevent himself from killing Aeris, and then this happens. Aeris looks up and presumably sees Cloud, smiling at him. The camera then pans upwards, a black-cloaked figure descending towards her. It's Sephiroth, and before we well and truly register that he's there, he uses his sword to impale Aeris. What follows next is equal parts terrifying yet beautiful. There's a moment of silence accentuated by what seems to be the sound of a heartbeat. Is it Aeris' heartbeat? Cloud's? I don't know, but I'll be damned if it doesn't make this scene tense. Sephiroth then pulls back his sword and Aeris' hairband becomes undone. Her materia falls to the ground and the silence is suddenly broken by Aeris' theme, which punctuates the falling of the materia. Cloud manages to catch Aeris as she falls, and he gives an emotional outburst to Sephiroth. He doesn't care that he's the enemy. The only thing in his mind right now is that Aeris seems to be gone. Sephiroth's reaction is off though. He's seemingly surprised that Cloud has feelings and tells him to stop acting sad and angry. Cloud doesn't understand, but Sephiroth starts to tell Cloud that he's something, but he never finishes the sentence. When he flies off, he leaves a piece of Jenova behind. We'll have to fight the monster, all the while Aeris' theme keeps playing in the background. Jenova mainly does water elemental damage this time around, so equipping Leviathan linked with the elemental materia to someone's armor or equipping a water ring will make this fight very easy. But the fight with Jenova isn't what's important to me right now. It's what happens after. Jenova, for some reason, finishes Sephiroth's sentence and calls Cloud a puppet. Now, anybody familiar with JRPGs has seen the clip of Aerith getting killed, but aside from losing a party member, it also cements Sephiroth as the true villain of this story, actually bringing him to the foreground of the narrative by means of shocking the player. It's a brutal scene, and playing this in 1997 without any knowledge that it was going to happen must have been a shock. I remember distinctly about schoolyard rumors of there being a hidden way to bring Aeris back to life, like collecting 100 tissues from the gold saucer, master the revive materia to a hidden level by means of battle experience, and then do a convoluted sequence of events. None of it is true. There is no way beyond altering the game to bring Aeris back to life, and even if one did so by cheating, she doesn't have any physical influence left on the story besides her death. But still, her presence will be important the further we get through the story. But there's something I need to tell you about this scene and why I think it's so powerful. The other party members all react to Aeris' death in the following scene. There's no text and all of it is shown through body language. There are actually different scenes that result from this section where each character, depending on the party you use, has their own reaction to Aeris' demise. Stylistically, I think the lack of text is a great choice. It showcases that even with these limited graphics, the creators managed to convey an emotion without text. Sometimes that is the most powerful type of storytelling, and eventually this scene has to end, leaving us, the player, to deal with the finality of it all. Now normally this would be the point in the original release where you'd have to put in disc 2. If you played through this game back in the day, let me know in the comments what you did after you witnessed the screen pop up for the first time. For me, I remember I needed a quick break to deal with what just happened. I know these are digital characters, but over the course of the game, you get to experience their story and grow accustomed to them. Maybe I'm just overthinking this, but for me, there were some actual feels popping up. In any case, we're going to continue on to disc 2. After the events of the City of the Ancients, the group decides to sleep in the nearby cottage, coming to terms with what just happened. Cloud is just beyond himself at this point. Sephiroth destroyed Nibelheim, killed Aeris, and now he's planning to destroy the world itself. The group initially doesn't know where Sephiroth went, but luckily the connection that Cloud and him share works both ways. Cloud grabs his head and sees a vision of Sephiroth walking off in the distance. We follow his trail and start climbing our way up the mountain. Once we reach the overworld, we'll find ourselves in a snow-covered area. Our next destination will be a place called the Icicle Inn. Once we reach the town, we'll find that we can't progress any further as there's no way to go down the mountainside just yet. A man near the edge of the town tells us to look out for some people on the other side, and Elena shows up together with some Shinra troops. She's angry about the state that she found Sang in after what happened in the Temple of the Ancients, and subsequently, she punches us out cold before putting us in one of the houses in the town. Inside the house, we discover research tape by a Professor Gast, a former researcher at Shinra and Hojo's research partner. We learn that Gast had been in contact with a member of the Cetra a couple of decades earlier. This was Aeris' mother. If we continue looking through the tapes, we'll find out that Professor Gast and Aeris' mother would start a relationship, which would eventually result in Aeris being born. We also learn of an event that happened 2,000 years ago which led to the destruction of the Ancients called the Crisis from the Sky. It turns out we had the wrong idea about Jenova the entire time. Jenova is not an ancient, but she turned out to be the Crisis from the Sky. When Jenova crashed onto the planet, it injured it, leading to the planet trying to heal itself with a life stream. At the same time, the threat Jenova posed also led to it creating a defense mechanism called Weapon. These will be integral to the story later on. Eventually, Weapon turned out to be never used as the Ancients found a way to contain Jenova. However, as long as Jenova exists, the planet will never be able to fully heal itself. But what does all of this mean exactly? Well, it does change a lot of our initial assumptions. Sephiroth is apparently not an ancient, but a mix of human and Jenova's DNA. We knew this, of course, but we were acting under the assumption that Jenova was an ancient. What this does mean is that with Aeris gone, the ancient race is truly extinct. The last video that we can watch is a detail of Professor Gast trying to make a video of his daughter. Knowing what just happened earlier in the City of the Ancients makes this a little bit more tragic. At this point, we can also leave the town because we need to head to a place called Gaea's Cliff. We can take a snowboard from one of the kids in the houses. This leads to another minigame where we'll have to snowboard down the mountain with Cloud. I will save you most of the horrible gameplay footage from that. Let's just say I won't be doing any sports games anytime soon. We're now on our way to Gaea's cliff, and we have to cross an ice field to do so. At the end, we'll have to get to a small cabin where we meet a man called Holtzoff, who will explain to us how to climb Gaea's cliff. Essentially, there's not much of a change from regular movement, but a new meter will be added which shows the character's body temperature. While climbing, we can't let our body temperature get too low, so every now and again, we need to make Cloud jog in place to keep him warm. Eventually, we'll make our way to the top of Gaea's cliff, and we see one of the black-cloaked figures falling over in front of us. We have only seconds to prepare, as we have to face off against a two-headed dragon. I'll be fair, I completely forgot about this boss, and he nearly wiped my entire party. I was already dreading going through the entire mountain section again. The boss has two heads, one which can do fire attacks and one which can do ice attacks. The best thing is to focus on one of the heads and take care of that one before focusing on the other. All attacks are magic based, so a combination of elemental materia with fire and ice in the armor slot is going to be recommended for this battle. When the beast finally goes down, we can continue on to the last part of the climbing section and we reach the top of Gaea's cliff. This is the Northern Crater, the place where Jenova crashed onto the planet all those years ago. While we're making our way towards the Northern Crater, Cloud notices an airship in the sky. We switch over to Rufus on board the airship, and him and his team are elated by the fact that they finally found the Promised Land. Hojo is apparently on board as well, and he's laughing to himself as he says that this is where the reunion will take place. As we switch back to Cloud, we continue on and will encounter more black-cloaked figures heading up the crater. And now this is where the reunion theory rears itself. As we've seen throughout the game, most of the black-cloaked figures have been heading towards Sephiroth this whole time. This is because of the Jenova cells. People infected with Jenova cells want to return to Jenova, the programming from the cells overriding their free will. We encounter who we think is Sephiroth near the end of the Northern Crater, but something is off. He says his body has outlived its usefulness and he disappears. Cloud apparently feels something drawing him towards Sephiroth, and I think we can already guess what it is. Cloud is infected with Jenova cells, but the story is going to get even more complex from here on out. Sephiroth appears again behind us and he attacks us, knocking us to the ground before we start fighting him. Yet when we get to the battle screen, we're not fighting Sephiroth. We're fighting Jenova, which doesn't make any sense, but trust me, it will later on. This fight is against Jenova Death. Unlike its previous form in the City of the Ancients, which primarily used water magic, this one will use fire magic. Jenova has high magic damage, so the best thing to do is to ensure that, like the last form, the proper materia are equipped in the armor slots so we can tank the hits while we retaliate with whatever is effective. Jenova will mainly use her red light attack. It's a fire-based attack which can hit 3 times in one turn. She will also try to silence characters, leaving them unable to use magic, so a secondary healer is definitely recommended for this battle. Eventually, this form of Jenova goes down, and we start to put together that Sephiroth might not be who we think he has been all this time. Jenova Death apparently leaves the black materia behind. Cloud doesn't trust himself after the situation at the Temple of the Ancients and chooses to leave the black materia behind in the hands of Barret. We'll continue further on into the Northern Crater now, and we try to make sense out of all the stuff that's happening. Suddenly, we're engulfed in a flash of light and we find ourselves transported to a vision of Nibelheim from 5 years ago. Just like in the flashback sequence in Kalm, Sephiroth shows up at the entrance of the town, but he's now followed by a black-haired man who we haven't seen before instead of Cloud. Tifa tries to ensure Cloud it's just an illusion, but then we're transported further ahead to the destruction of Nibelheim. Cloud sees the black-haired man come out of the Shinra mansion instead of himself, but he's convinced that all of this is a hoax. But then Sephiroth shows up, and he tells us that things aren't as they seem. He claims that Cloud is a clone of Sephiroth who contains Jenova cells. Cloud doesn't believe him at first. He remembers the heat and the fire in Nibelheim, but Sephiroth is adamant about it being true, calling him a mere puppet. He explains that 5 years ago, Hojo put Cloud together piece by piece after Nibelheim was burnt. He then also says that Hojo thought Cloud was an incomplete clone, and he didn't even bother to give him a number like he did with the other cloaked figures. In further media, we'll find out that the black-robed men are Sephiroth clones, or rather, copies. It turns out that these are the original survivors of the Nibelheim incident who were rounded up by Hojo and experimented on. From what I can tell, they were injected with Jenova cells and showered with Mako, just like we'd seen with the creature inside the Nibelheim reactor. Most of these victims died. Others retained some of their personalities, while the clones that we see became slaves to Sephiroth's will. They were given numbers by Hojo to determine the successful clones in an effort to prove his reunion theory. Back to the party, Tifa tells us not to listen to Sephiroth, but Sephiroth's words and Tifa's silence brings a doubt to Cloud's mind. Cloud being created by Hojo 5 years ago would explain the gaps in his memories and how Sephiroth was able to control him. Sephiroth continues to provoke Cloud, making him doubt that he is the person who he thinks he is. And it is here that we need to back up the story a little bit. Remember when we were in Kalm and we were going through the entire flashback section? We had our picture taken. This is where that's going to come into play. Sephiroth apparently remembers this as well, and he sees the man who took the photo lying close by. He then grabs the photo and shows it to the party, which shows that Cloud isn't in the picture at all. He's replaced by the black-haired man that we saw earlier. Now initially, Cloud believes this to be another one of Sephiroth's lies. He tries to recall all of his past events, but he gets stuck when he gets to the point where he joined up with Soldier, because he doesn't remember how he joined up with Soldier. He grabs his head in pain, trying to remember desperately on how he joined up, but he manages to shake it off slightly before he decides to continue. In another location, Rufus and his team show up in the northern crater, and they're amazed by the amount of Mako that they find. The ground starts to shake, and Hojo thinks that this must be the work of Weapon, the ancient things that we learned about back in the Icicle Inn from Professor Gast's tapes. A gigantic eye appears in the background as they continue to look around the place. We then return to the rest of the party that we left the black materia with. Suddenly, the background changes to a psychedelic mass, and Barrett can't find the rest of the group anymore. From behind him, Tifa shows up and says that Cloud is in trouble. Barrett runs off, and it's revealed that this was Sephiroth, or at least we think it was. At the location where Rufus, Hojo, and Scarlet are at, a flash of light suddenly transports Cloud and Tifa to the same place. Cloud warns Rufus's team to get out, as he believes that they are at the site where the reunion will happen. However, Hojo and Rufus refuse to leave. Cloud then starts acting weird, and he goes up to Barrett, asking for the black materia. As soon as he has it, a weird voice rings out, and Cloud apologizes for some reason, saying that maybe someday Tifa will be able to meet the real Cloud. Now Hojo at this point is over the moon. He believes his experiment to be a success, and he asks Cloud what his Sephiroth clone number is, seeing that he doesn't have a tattoo. Now this makes Hojo mad after Cloud begs him to give him a number, disgusted that only a failed experiment in his eyes managed to make it to the northern crater. Cloud is then lifted towards the ceiling. Hojo explains to Rufus who he thinks Cloud is, and that his creation is meant to prove his reunion theory. It's clear at this point that Hojo is not there for what Rufus thinks is the Promised Land. He's only interested in his own scientific progress. Another weird thing about the reunion theory is that Hojo believed that Jenova-infected people would converge onto Midgar, as that is where Jenova's body was being stored. However, instead, Jenova's body itself left Midgar, presumably heading towards the northern crater as well. But at one point, all of this starts to make sense. Sephiroth is at the northern crater, and it is his will that actually overpowers Jenova's. This means in turn that instead of converging on Jenova, everyone is actually converging onto Sephiroth. And this also starts to make sense for Cloud now. He was never chasing Sephiroth to begin with. Instead, he was the one that was being summoned by Sephiroth to join him in the Northern Crater. Cloud at this point seems to have given in to his existence as a clone and tells Sephiroth that he's here. He's here to give him the black materia. We move towards the middle of the ceiling. A blue crystal falls out, revealing Sephiroth inside. The rest of the party yells out to Cloud to stop, but his programming is too strong as he hands over the black materia to Sephiroth inside the crystal. The crater then begins to shake, and a massive energy spike shoots out from underneath. The team barely able to escape in the high wind. Gigantic creatures start to shoot out from the crater. These are the so-called weapons that we learned about earlier. They scatter towards different areas of the planet, and the screen goes black as we can hear the wails of the planet, leaving us with Cloud in the middle of the darkness, walking away, as Tifa tries to chase him, but fails. Tifa then starts to remember how she found Cloud near the Sector 7 train station. He was seemingly in a catatonic state before he wakes up, and determines himself to be the Cloud that we know. Now, this is a pivotal moment in the story that you might miss if you don't put all the facts together, but it raises some questions. As we learned, Sephiroth said that Cloud didn't exist until Hojo created him 5 years ago. However, this doesn't make complete sense. Tifa obviously knows who Cloud is, so unless they met somewhere else but when they were kids, there's no way that she should know who he is. Tifa also thinks that something is wrong, and something that she says doesn't sound right. She says that it has been 7 years since the two of them saw each other. Now, this raises a few questions. If Cloud left town 7 years ago to join Soldier, and that is the last time they met, how does he have the knowledge about what happened in Nibelheim if the black-haired man was the one who was actually there during those events? And then another question is, if Cloud did exist before the events of the Nibelheim incident, what happened to him in the meantime to make him end up in the fractured state that Tifa found him in Sector 7? Now, the timeline from here on out becomes pretty vague from the time that Tifa found Cloud. Tifa tells us that Cloud apparently wanted to leave and be a mercenary, but she didn't want this to happen. At this point, she tells him about the Avalanche job, which we started off the game with. This leads me to think that the time between Tifa finding Cloud at the station to the beginning of the game couldn't be more than, I'd say, a few days or a few weeks. This is going to be crucial information later on, and without explaining too much, I'm just going to tell you that things are not exactly the way that they seem right now. Tifa wakes up a bit later and discovers that she and Barret have been imprisoned in Junon for about a week. Tifa asks Barret if he knows what happened to Cloud, but unfortunately, Barret is none the wiser. She then asks whatever happened to Sephiroth, and Barret explains that ever since the light erupted from the northern crater, the weapons have been tearing up the world outside. It also turns out that the northern crater is now shielded, making it unable to be approached by anyone. Barret then says that they should have beaten Weapon when they were at the northern crater, but unfortunately, they've run out of time. He then opens the blinds to show what he means. Meteor is on its way, clearly heading towards the planet. It's then that Rufus and Heidegger enter the chamber. Rufus says that Meteor was summoned and he's accepted this fact. Heidegger then states that the preparations for the public execution are ready. Shinra has apparently planned to execute Tifa and Barret on live television to ease the minds of the people, as by no doubt they've probably stated that Avalanche are responsible for Meteor heading towards the planet. We then make our way towards the execution room. Tifa is chosen to go first and is guided towards the gas chamber by Scarlet. Barret tries to stop Scarlet and be the first instead, but Scarlet just laughs and tells the camera to focus on him because the audience just loves tearful goodbyes. I'll be honest, this interaction is absolutely brutal. The Shinra executives apparently care so little about human life and are so ingrained in their ways of holding control over the populace that they have zero issues with executing innocents, just like we saw with the platefall in Midgar earlier on. It's raw, unforgiving, and as I was going through this scene, it hit me that throughout the story of FF7, there are some heavy themes being touched upon, like class disparity. The people living in the slums in Midgar are seen as second-rate citizens, evident by Shinra not caring that they had to kill thousands, if not more, to just try and kill a small group of people like Avalanche. The story pictures Shinra as an amoral corporation who has essentially risen to becoming the de facto ruler of not only Midgar, but basically anywhere in the world where a Mako reactor is present. They have their own army, almost anything is owned or subsidized by Shinra. They're essentially the rulers of the world. But even this is not enough for them. Once they find out about the Promised Land, it only gives them more incentive to cement their hold that they already have over the world. It paints a very dark picture of the possibilities that arise from a private company becoming essentially bigger than a chosen government. Everything is about profits and power, while other things like quality of life or just plain humane treatment of other people is seen as unimportant. In any case, back to the story. Tifa is in the gas chamber and it looks like she could die at any moment. Scarlet even slaps Tifa before she walks off. The soldier who chained Tifa walks off as well, but he drops a key in front of Tifa's feet. However, before the Shinra can end her, an alarm goes off saying that weapon is on its way to Junon. Everyone runs off in a panic until we find out that Cait Sith was apparently hiding within the audience in disguise. He knocks out Scarlet and sets Barret free. We then fight some Shinra guards. Initially, this just seems like a simple battle, but it's already too late. The gas chamber has started. In another room, we see Heidegger making his way to Rufus, reporting that weapon is on its way. Rufus doesn't seem to be worried though, as they have a secret weapon, the cannon at Junon. Immediately, they fire the cannon and it stays eerily silent for a few moments, everyone believing that they were successful. However, before long, the alarm starts again and Shinra tries to hold weapon off with simple conventional weapons while they reload that cannon. Everything seems to be in vain though when weapon crashes into Junon. While this is going on, Barret is still desperately trying to free Tifa, but unfortunately there's no way inside the chamber. Cait Sith suggests that we find another way to help Tifa and we run out of the room. The door closes behind us and we hear Scarlet on the other side, taunting us that we just gave up our last possibility to save Tifa. With no way back inside, we continue on to the outer perimeter of Junon, and it is there that we find Yuffie in disguise as a reporter. We also finally get a good look at weapon. This is Sapphire Weapon and it will be the first of its kind that we'll physically encounter in the game. We run off to the docks where we find the airship called the Highwind. We'll have to fight off a few members of Soldier along the way, but by this point they're basic enemies. When we reach the Highwind, we realize that we've hit a dead end. There's no way for us to go any further. It's at this point that we switch over to Tifa in the gas chamber, desperately trying to get free. By using the controls that the game indicates, we can move Tifa's limbs in an effort to pick up the key and undo our shackles. Tifa then tries to open the door, but it's locked tight. There's no way to get it to open. We then see Sapphire Weapon who starts to attack Junon with its beam attack, opening up a tear in the structure where Tifa is. How convenient, I guess. It then starts to charge up another attack, but in one of the most clutch moments I've seen in a while. The Junon cannon is apparently reloaded and fires, blowing Weapon's head clean off. Tifa then makes her way outside of the gas chamber through the tear that we saw earlier. She runs all the way to the end of the barrel of the cannon, but Scarlet is on her heels. At the end they get into I don't know what else to call this, a slapping match? I'm gonna call it a slapping match, and Scarlet orders her troops to take Tifa away. However, a voice calls out for Tifa to run to the end of the cannon. It turns out the team is taking command of the Highwind. Barret drops down a rope and Tifa runs off the edge of the cannon, barely able to grab the rope before we fly off. And it's after this scene and when we get to the overworld where the game is going to open up severely. Before this section we were limited in our movement due to the ocean separating the land masses. Unfortunately, the buggy and the tiny Bronco could only take us so far, but with the Highwind, we can go almost anywhere in the overworld. We then have to think about what we need to do next. Red suggests that Cloud may have washed into the lifestream during the crater's collapse, and there is a place where the lifestream often comes up through the ocean floor, the town of Mideel. It looks like this is the only information that we have to go on right now, so it's time to head to Mideel in our brand new airship. But before we head to Mideel, I need to talk about the Highwind for a bit. The airship is basically going to act as our base of operations when we're heading out to the different destinations. We'll be able to talk to our team in the cockpit, and in the operations room, we can change our party setup, save our game, and heal the party. It's also going to serve as the meeting room later on in the game. Now, control of the airship is fairly simple. We're able to move forward and change our altitude on the overworld by using the OK button and the directional keys. Unfortunately, at this point I didn't have my controller set up, so I can only tell you the keyboard commands. I doubt they're very different though. It's also important to note that you can't just land anywhere. You'll only be able to land on flat fields, so forests and such are off limits. We finally get to the town of Mideel, and near the entrance, Tifa hears that someone washed up on the shore about a week ago, coinciding with the time when we lost Cloud at the northern crater. Tifa then talks to the villagers, and she finds out that the guy was brought to the local doctor. We head over to the doctor, and sure enough, Cloud is sitting in a wheelchair. He's unresponsive as his time in the lifestream gave him Mako poisoning, a condition which will be very important later on when we talk about Cloud's backstory. Tifa decides to stay with Cloud while Barret and Sid go back to the Highwind and figure out what to do next. After Mideel, Cait Sith tells us that he can eavesdrop on the Shinra board meetings. The group listens as Rufus and the executives want to destroy the meteor heading towards the planet by using huge pieces of materia, which they then want to store into a rocket and shoot at Meteor. Since we're missing Cloud and Tifa, we choose Sid to act as the leader of the group, and we have our next mission, retrieving all of the huge materia, the first of which is on a train heading for North Corel. Now, I started thinking at this point, why would we do this? The huge materia seems like the safest bet that we have for stopping Meteor. But as we'll find out later, it wouldn't make a difference. Meteor cannot be stopped unless Sephiroth is destroyed, and I'm sure the party thinks this as well when they set out to steal the materia. We'll head over to North Corel and make our way towards the Mako reactor that we discovered when we made our way there the first time. Unfortunately, we're too late, as the train takes off from the reactor carrying the huge materia on it. We managed to get onto another train, and we'll have to catch up to the first one by constantly moving levers up and down. I initially thought I was doing something wrong, but if you just keep moving them up and down, eventually we'll catch up to the first train. We then jump on the train when we get close to it, and we'll have to move up from car to car, fighting enemies on every single one of them. It's important to note that we're dealing with yet another timer that will not stop, regardless of pausing the game or not. It's not a very hard sequence of battles at this point, but most likely you might have to use characters that you haven't used before. I've barely used Sid and Yuffie at this point, so while I fix their equipment and materia, they haven't leveled up in the sense of limit breaks, and most of them are still at level 1. When we finally reach the front of the train with about a minute left to spare, we'll have to pull back the levers again to brake the train, barely coming to a standstill before we'd hit North Corel. After holding off the destruction of the town, the inhabitants thank us, and it's important to note that if you had Barret in your party at this point, the villagers will forgive him for the events which happened all those years ago when Shinra murdered most of the inhabitants of the town, finally bringing a big part of his story to a close. We then head to the rebel base Fort Condor, where we have to defend a phoenix who is nested on top of the building from approaching Shinra soldiers. In this section, we're forced into a sort of tactical mini-game where we'll have to fight off waves of enemies by placing units on the field using our own money. You can do this if you want to. For me, the pacing of this section is just unnecessarily slow, even on the highest speed setting. This is an optional part though. By this time, we've leveled up so much that the boss that appears when the enemies do reach the egg is a trivial matter, and we can kill it in seconds. After the battle is over, the phoenix dies, but the egg hatches, revealing a new member of its species has been born, even though it kinda just resembles a big chocobo. The newborn flies off, and we report back to the leader of Fort Condor, who gives us the huge materia. We then head back to the Highwind and decide to make our way to Mideel one more time to check up on Tifa and Cloud. We talked to Tifa and not much has changed. Cloud is still completely out of it and Tifa wonders if he'll ever recover. Suddenly the ground starts shaking. Lifestream starts to apparently burst from the ground, tearing the town apart. To make matters worse, one of the other weapons, Ultimate Weapon, shows up and we're forced into combat with it. Ultimate Weapon is no joke, but luckily for us he is a scripted event for this battle. He'll use a few attacks like Quake 2, a basic claw attack, but finishes his sequence with Ultima Beam that does a crazy amount of damage, and then he flies off. As Ultimate Weapon goes away, we think we're finally in the clear, but we're soon interrupted as the ground starts shaking once again. Sid yells out to Cloud and Tifa to get away. Tifa starts wheeling Cloud out of the clinic, but they're soon caught up in the town disintegrating underneath their feet, falling into the livestream below, and are seemingly lost forever. Tifa is seemingly alone in a black void. She tries to reach out for Cloud, but there's no answer. She yells out for someone, anyone to help her, and eventually she'll yell for Cloud. And this is when something seems to happen. Tifa grabs her head and starts spinning around, seemingly being transported somewhere else. I'd like to note that during this time, we can hear the sound which would normally indicate the voice of the planet. So my idea is that this is the planet responding to Tifa's plea. She wakes up in a strange, dreamlike place, finding several versions of Cloud sitting around. This is Cloud's inner mind. It's fragmented, confused by all of the things that Sephiroth told him and the gaps in his own memory. One by one, we have to put his personality back together, bringing Cloud back to at least a resemblance of his original self. The first section deals with Sephiroth's arrival to Nibelheim. Tifa starts listing things about the town which should be familiar to Cloud. We start recounting the events of that day again. Once again, Cloud thinks that he's the one that arrived with Sephiroth, trying to hold on to the reality that makes the most sense for him. But Tifa corrects him. She says that Cloud never arrived to Nibelheim that day, and she knows, because she was waiting for him to come by. But how did she know that he was supposed to come by? Well, I'd like to think that the townsfolk were informed beforehand that members of Soldier were going to come by. And as far as Tifa knows, the last thing she heard from Cloud was that he was going to join Soldier. So I guess that just means she held on to hope that he would be the one. But Cloud never comes by. Instead, it's the black-haired Soldier once again. And this cements one event for us. Cloud was not the Soldier that arrived that day. It was indeed the black-haired man. But there's still more to this story. The next event deals with Cloud and Tifa's night at the well when they were children. The event plays out exactly like it did in the beginning of the game, and this clears up yet another thing. This event did happen in the past, so it puts into doubt that Cloud was created 5 years ago by Hojo. Next, Tifa tries to discover what happened to Cloud after he left the village. She always felt that his decision to join Soldier came out of nowhere. A voice then rings out and it's another version of Cloud, the child version from his youth. He says that the decision to join Soldier was because he wanted to be noticed, specifically by Tifa herself. Tifa doesn't understand this at first, but they start to recall the true events from Cloud's youth. It turns out that Cloud and Tifa were never the childhood friends that they thought they were. They knew each other, but beside the event of the well, they didn't really interact all that much in the beginning. Tifa and Cloud were actually two completely different people when they were growing up. Tifa was the popular kid hanging out with all the other kids in town, while Cloud lived as a loner, unable to connect with the other kids. Despite this, Cloud did have feelings for Tifa, but his personality hindered his attempts to connect with others. During their time growing up, Tifa's mother suddenly passed away. Now this event would influence Tifa in a way that I think any young child would feel after the death of a parent. She was in denial, completely overwhelmed by grief, and she managed to convince herself that if she crossed Mount Nibel, she would be able to see her mother again. When she finally decides to make the journey up the mountain, none of her friends join her except for Cloud, who despite being a loner feels the need to protect Tifa but not stop her as she goes to Mount Nibel. However, the journey would turn out a lot different than either of them would have wanted. Both of them fall down the mountain, with Cloud getting away with just some scraped knees, while Tifa's condition was critical. When the two of them were found by the townspeople, Cloud was blamed by the locals, seen as the person who dragged Tifa out to Mount Nibel for some foolish adventure. And this is a crucial part, as it is where their cognitions about the event differ so much. For Cloud, it reinforced the feeling about himself that he was worthless, incapable of protecting anyone. His well-meant reason for joining Tifa were not seen by the townsfolk, and since he never formed a good connection with them, their rejection of him instilled a heavily rooted sense of anxiety, which led to him acting out as a child. Cloud from here on tries to act tough, even to the point of bullying others to hide his own insecurities. Now, a lot of this is hard to make up from the context of the game alone. It doesn't go that in-depth into the feelings of the two, but there is a Final Fantasy VII novella called Trace of Two Pasts, which goes deeper into Cloud's and Tifa's psyche during this time. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, it only had a Japanese release, but there have been some translated parts around the internet. For Tifa, the event at Mount Nibel also had a huge effect on her life. The loss of her mother weighed heavily on her, but she knew that she was unable to see her anymore, accepting that she had truly passed away. Instead of grieving, she decides to channel her energy to learn martial arts under a passing martial arts master called Zangen. At the same time, she also learned the ins and outs of Mount Nibel, becoming one of the town's best mountain guides. Tifa also never forgot about Cloud, as he was the only person to actually follow her up the mountain. While everyone in town saw Cloud negatively, Tifa knew that he went up the mountain with her in order to protect her, and in turn, this led to her starting to develop feelings for him. But because neither Tifa or Cloud are able to voice their feelings for one another, Cloud sees it once again as a form of rejection, leading to him choosing the final option he has to be noticed by Tifa, joining Soldier. Now, I say being noticed, but for Cloud, the reasoning behind joining Soldier is two-sided. He also wants to desperately prove to himself that he does have the strength to protect others. But due to them not communicating, for Tifa, Cloud's decision to join Soldier is seen as him fleeing Nibelheim and leaving her behind. She didn't realize that she was actually the reason why Cloud wanted to grow stronger to begin with. Tifa and Cloud then go back to their cognition of the events which led to the destruction of Nibelheim, specifically the time when she confronted Sephiroth inside of the reactor. The scene plays out as you might think. Sephiroth strikes Tifa with his sword and she falls down the stairs. However, unlike the last time, Cloud doesn't show up. Once again, it's the black-haired Soldier. But this time, we finally learn his name, Zack. And we've heard that name before earlier on in the game. Zack is the name of the couple's son in Gongaga village, and if you happen to play through the prequel of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, or you still remember the parts of the game that mention him, you'd know that he was also the former boyfriend of Aeris. Zack tried to confront Sephiroth inside of the Genova room, but he's unsuccessful. But it's then that somebody else walks in. We see a Shinra infantryman grab the Buster Sword from Zack and rush into the Genova room and witness him stabbing Sephiroth while he curses at him for taking away his mom and injuring Tifa. Now, I'm fairly sure you can already tell who this is and what the implications are. The infantryman takes his helmet off and it's revealed to be Cloud, who has been in Nibelheim the entire time, explaining how he had knowledge of these events. Okay, now if this is a lot of information for you to process right now, I completely understand. We've been getting bits and pieces of information of the story throughout the game, but they've been more like red herrings up until this point. And I think the easiest way that I'm going to explain all of this to you is by telling you exactly what's been going on up until this point. Cloud was not the close friend of Sephiroth. Instead, it was Zack. Cloud was present during the entire time in Nibelheim as the faceless infantryman who we interact with during the course of the flashbacks. He never made it to Soldier, instead opting to become an infantryman instead, probably because he couldn't go home and face Tifa after not fulfilling his promise of joining Soldier. And these feelings are probably also why he never took off his helmet in Nibelheim. He must have been ecstatic to see Tifa again, but at that point the shame that he felt about not being in Soldier must have been too great to bear. So this clears up a lot of the story. We are now certain that Sephiroth was lying about Cloud being created by Hojo. But there's still a part of this equation missing though. What happened to Cloud between Nibelheim and the start of the game? We know Tifa found him at the Sector 7 train station before the start of the game. But what happened before, well, that is still a mystery. We'll get to that later, and this part is going to make a lot more sense later on. Some more parts of the Nibelheim events are elaborated on as well. We see Sephiroth walking out of the room with Jenova's severed head. Cloud tries to chase him, but Sephiroth stabs him with his sword. At this point, Cloud probably has to be filled with adrenaline because in a feat of strength, he actually uses the leverage of the sword to lift Sephiroth up and throw him into the life stream underneath. And with this part, we have the final part of the puzzle regarding the reunion and why Jenova's body escaped Midgar. Due to Sephiroth's will overpowering Jenova by what I'm guessing is merging with Jenova's head, he's essentially become the new primary entity for Jenova itself at the Northern Crater. This means that both the body and the Black Robe clones all wanted to converge with him instead of Jenova itself at this point. After going through all of these events, Tifa brings all of Cloud's aspects together. They start to merge with his child self and the picture becomes more clear. We can tell that this is not the same Cloud as we've been following all this time because he says, "We finally meet again" to Tifa. This is the actual Cloud who came to Nibelheim all those years ago. Tifa and Cloud then decide to head back towards the surface world. How they do this, I have no idea. I consider this to be plot convenient space magic at this point, but I'm sure it has to do with the planet guiding them back in order to save the world. The two of them end up in Mideel, where the rest of the group find them. When we return to the High Wind, Cloud apologizes to everyone else for what he did at the Northern Crater, and says he wants to stop Sephiroth for good. And I feel that this part is one of the reasons which sets Cloud apart from Sephiroth. See, Cloud actively accepts that what he thinks was his life was a lie. He eventually comes to terms what has happened to him and decides to move forward as his own person. And then compare this with Sephiroth, who had a complete change of heart when he found out his mother was Jenova, and you see both sides of the coin. Cloud, at least eventually with help from Tifa, accepts himself, while Sephiroth is on a mad quest to basically destroy the world to get into good graces with who he thinks is his mother. And yes, I'm saying who he thinks is his mother because this intrigue goes even deeper than we think it does right now. We'll get into more of this later, but for now, let's continue the main story and start our search for the next huge materia. At this point, we have the party back together, and if we want to continue the story, we'll need to head to Junon since it's there that the next huge materia is located. However, we're going to do something different. We're going to head back to the Bone Village to do some more digging. It's here that we can dig up the key to Sector 5. Now, why would we want the key to Sector 5 and why is it here? I have no idea, but we're going to head back to Midgar to pick something up. We'll head back to Midgar in the High Wind to return to the perimeter where we initially left the city in the first place. The key we dug up in Bone Village will open the door for us and we can get inside. To do what we want to do in Midgar, we'll need to head to Wall Market, but before that, I feel compelled to show you something in the church, where we first met Aeris. When we go inside, we can see two children and, weirdly enough, Aeris is tending the flowers as well. However, when we get closer, she'll flicker out of existence, the girl even wondering where the flower lady went. Now, this is a one-time event that will happen after we get Cloud back from his inner mind. After this, we'll be unable to witness it again unless we were to glitch the game or use the debug room in the game. It's actually possible to witness this event before her death. You can have the same event as well after Sang kidnaps her and takes her to Shinra headquarters in Disc 1. But the reasoning behind this section always made me question why. Is it a glitch? Was it put there to get an emotional reaction from the player? I don't know. I just wanted to share this little tidbit. From here on, we're going to continue on to the wall market, and we'll need Sid in the party for this. We'll move inside one of the buildings where Sid wants to take a look at one of the computers. Being the tech genius that he is, he kicks it, which for some weird reason makes it work. This will give us Tifa's ultimate weapon, the Premium Heart. And I feel I should explain a bit about this. Every character has their own ultimate weapon along with their own prerequisites to obtaining them. Tifa's just happened to coincide with us having the High Wind available again, but we'll pick up some of the others later. They also happen to have their own damage calculations. The Premium Heart, for example, does damage based on how full our limit break bar is, along with our limit break level. From Midgar, we'll continue on to Junon to find a third huge materia and eventually find Reno, who is trying to load the materia into a submarine. We fight off an enemy sent to us by Reno, but it gives him time to escape. We then chase after the submarine carrying the huge materia in yet another minigame. This time we're put in control of our own submarine and we have to chase down the other one by means of sonar. Out of all the minigames, this was my second favorite after the motorcycle minigame from the beginning. After we find and destroy the red submarine, we can load the huge materia onto our own for safekeeping. And then we also learn about the last huge materia location. It turns out the last piece was already loaded onto the rocket in Rocket Town, and Shinra is going to launch it at Meteor anyway, despite missing the other 3 pieces. We make our way to Rocket Town and board the rocket, but Palmer launches it remotely. Most of the party is upset by this because it takes us away from the planet. I say most, because it's not that way for Sid. He can finally fulfill his lifelong dream of going to space. Inside the rocket, we'll find the last huge materia, but it's protected by a code. Failing to get the code right will lead to us losing this materia forever, but luckily we managed to crack it at the last possible moment. As we try to make our way out of the rocket, we head towards the tail section to escape. However, when we get to the oxygen tanks, one of them explodes, trapping Sid underneath it. The team can't seem to lift the debris off of him, and he's telling Tifa and Cloud to get out. Sid then has a realization as he discovers that it was oxygen tank number 8 that blew up, the exact same one that Shara was trying to fix during his failed launch event. This makes Sid realize that Shara was right all along. To his surprise, Shara comes into the room and helps the rest of the team to lift the debris off of him, with Sid finally apologizing to Shara about how he treated her all this time. And I think this is good. This is exactly the closure to Sid's story that I was hoping for. Honestly, his treatment of her was the one thing that irked me the most about his character. We then escape from the rocket by using its escape pod, and we return back to the planet. Meanwhile, we see the rocket impacting on Meteor, but it does almost nothing. When we're back on land, we decide to head to Cosmo Canyon, where we can leave all of the huge materia with Bugenhagen for safekeeping. And while at Cosmo Canyon, we ask Bugenhagen for advice on what to do next. He tells us that the answer is inside us, and suddenly the team realizes that Aeris had the answer all along. We need to return to the Temple of the Ancients. When we make our way inside, Bugenhagen is able to communicate with the planet. He says that the planet told him that in times of crises, we must search for Holy, the ultimate white magic. Great, that means we need to find yet another piece of materia somewhere in the world. Except we don't. Up until the end of Disc 1, we had Holy with us all along. See, Aeris always had a piece of materia in her ribbon. In the beginning of the game, she told us that it did absolutely nothing, but that wasn't true. Holy is one of the most powerful spells in the story, and there simply wasn't anyone strong enough to wield its power. Cloud also finally realizes this and thinks all hope is lost because the white materia fell down the altar and into the water when Sephiroth killed Aeris. However, Aeris was apparently one step ahead of us when she decided to go to the Temple of the Ancients on her own. Somewhere along the course of the story, she realized that Holy was the only way to stop Sephiroth if he got his hands on the black materia. She made her way to the temple in order to pray to the planet to give her the power to summon Holy. And she did. The planet heard her prayers and wanted to give her the power. But there's a problem. Sephiroth. It's because of his influence that Holy can't be summoned, effectively blocking the only weapon we have left to stop Meteor from destroying the planet. This means we have only one thing left to do. We need to beat Sephiroth in order to save the world. There's only one problem. He's still surrounded by that barrier that's impossible for us to break. But it's then that Cait Sith tells us that Rufus has moved the Junon cannon to Midgar in order to fire it at Sephiroth. However, because of the threat that the cannon poses, another weapon called Diamond Weapon is making its way to Midgar in order to destroy it. Unfortunately for us, the cannon is the best shot, pun intended, that we have of getting rid of the energy barrier surrounding the northern crater. We get into the high wind and fly to Midgar, taking on Diamond Weapon. And the battle with Diamond Weapon is one where you need to get the mechanics down. It's initially immune to physical attacks, and we have to resort to using either magic or summons. For the first part of this fight, I suggest to use regen and heal materia to keep our health up while we attempt to do as much damage as possible. When its armor finally opens up, we're able to use our basic attacks on it as well, making damaging it a lot easier. It's important to note that when Diamond Weapon gets close to its low health, it will start a countdown. At the end of the countdown, it will use Diamond Flash, an attack which will reduce the party's health down to 13.5% regardless of stats. When we finally do win the battle, instead of a win screen, we're treated to a cutscene. Shinra fires the cannon, now dubbed the Sister Ray, at the northern crater. Unfortunately for Diamond Weapon, and luckily for us, it's directly in the line of fire. The beam shoots through Weapon, killing it before hitting the barrier at the crater and finally making it disappear. But unfortunately for Rufus, before Weapon was hit, it fired several beams towards Midgar. Rufus can only stand and watch as he is seemingly killed when the shells hit the Shinra building. So that's it, right? Shinra is finally gone. Actually, no. Not just yet. We finally find out who was controlling Cait Sith all this time. It was Reeve, one of the Shinra executives. It turns out someone took control of the Sister Ray and is threatening to fire it again. And this is a problem. The Sister Ray takes about 3 hours to cool down, and if it's fired so soon after the last shot, it might destroy Midgar along with it. We find out that Hojo is at the cannon's controls. Reeve wants everyone at Shinra to try and stop Hojo, but Heidegger and Scarlet disagree, arresting him instead. This means we need to head back to Midgar and stop Hojo in order to save the people who are still inside the city. We go back with the high wind and parachute into the city to get as close to Hojo as possible. We fight our way through Midgar, even having a final showdown with Reno, Rude, and Elena as we try to make our way up to the cannon controls. Right when we get to the Shinra building, we are faced by Heidegger and Scarlet, who are controlling a Shinra war robot called the Proud Claude. To be fair, this battle is kind of underwhelming at this point, but when we do beat it, we've essentially killed the remaining Shinra executives. The only one left is Hojo. When we finally reach the cannon controls, we find out that Hojo has gone completely off the deep end, claiming that he needs to send more energy to his son. Wait, Hojo has a son? Oh hell yes he does, and it's nobody else but Sephiroth himself. We then fight off Hojo, who is seemingly tough for just being a researcher. However, Hojo apparently had a plan to stop us as well by injecting himself with an abundance of Genova cells, turning himself into a mutated monstrosity. Hojo actually has 3 separate forms. His human form, Helitic Hojo, which I think might be a wrong translation, which should actually be Heretic Hojo, I'm not completely sure. And finally, there is Life Form Hojo N. His first form is simple. Hojo will summon 2 enemies, but the best strategy is to just ignore them and focus on Hojo himself instead. When he transforms into his next form, he starts to get dangerous. Hojo will be able to attack us while at the same time inflicting us with a poisoned and confused status, severely hindering our party from targeting him effectively. While we can target parts of Hojo's body separately and stop them from doing attacks, he'll regenerate them again after a few turns, making attacking his main body a priority. Hojo's last form is also annoying as he'll be able to inflict even more statuses during battle. Luckily for us, the counter and cover materia combination is very effective in this fight, but bringing an abundance of curatives is highly recommended. But when we finish the battle and Hojo finally kicks the bucket, we finally destroyed the Shinra company. And with all of that, we finally arrived at Disc 3, the final leg of this adventure in the world of Final Fantasy VII. Things are escalating, and we find out that we have less than a week left before Meteor is going to impact the planet. We see Cloud speaking to the rest of the team on board of the Highwind. With the shield surrounding the northern crater gone, there's nothing stopping us from finally taking the fight to Sephiroth. However, Cloud tells the others he's not going to force them to come with him inside the northern crater. He realizes that this might be a one-way mission that some of them might not return from. He then tells the team that they're going to disband for now so they can be with the people they love and meet up a few days later. Whoever wants to come onto the mission can come along, but he won't hold it against them if they decide not to show up. As everyone is gone, Cloud and Tifa spend some time together. They finally open up to each other, and it's early morning before they finally decide to head back to the Highwind. When they get back inside, we find out that everyone actually returned, meaning we'll have the full team to face off against Sephiroth. The team then sets off to the northern crater in order to engage in the final battle. Or do they? Now that we're in Disc 3 and we've landed in the northern crater, we can do two things. We can make a beeline for Sephiroth, or we can head back into the Highwind and explore some of the remaining side content that the game has to offer. And the latter is what we're going to do. We still haven't gotten all the answers that we need for the storyline. There are some gaps regarding to what happened to Cloud in the time between Nibelheim and his arrival to Midgar. And the answers to these questions can be found in one place. We once again need to return to Nibelheim. When we return to the town and head inside the Shinra mansion, Cloud has yet another flashback. It turns that after the event in the Nibelheim reactor with Sephiroth, both Zack and Cloud were taken captive by Hojo and experimented on. But what did he do exactly? Well, he injected both Zack and Cloud with Genova cells and showered them with Mako for a few years. How long is left uncertain. For Zack, this didn't matter all that much. Yes, he was kept as a subject as well, and I'm sure that the experiments must have had some effect on him, but by this time he was already a full-fledged soldier first class, and he had already undergone Mako treatments from his time at Shinra, so I'm guessing he must have had a sort of resistance to the experiments. And you can tell when you compare Zack's condition to that of Cloud, who is truly affected. The combination of the long exposure to Mako and the Genova cells put him in sort of a comatose state. He's still responsive, he can reply in grunts and such, but I'm fairly sure he's not cognitive of what's happening around him. Sometime after the events of the reactor, the two are able to escape. Zack dresses Cloud in a soldier costume and drags him out of Nibelheim, where they try to escape, eventually hitching a ride in someone's car. It's here that Zack talks to Cloud, wondering what they're going to do when they reach Midgar. Eventually, Zack decides on becoming a mercenary before stating that he's not going to abandon Cloud. And the final bit of this scene is brutal. Cloud and Zack finally make their way to the outskirts of Midgar, so close to their final goal. However, just before they're able to get inside the city, they're ambushed by a group of Shinra soldiers. Zack tries to fight them off, but there are just too many, and eventually he's overwhelmed, shot to death on a cliff overlooking the city. The soldiers decide not to kill Cloud as they think the Mako poisoning is probably going to finish him off in due time. Cloud then crawls towards the body of Zack and grabs the Buster Sword, the scene ending in a shot of Midgar. And this is the final piece of the puzzle that we needed. Zack's conversation with Cloud coincides with everything that Cloud said he was at the beginning of the game. Because of his broken mental state, he's essentially taken over everything that Zack told him on their way to Midgar. Essentially what has happened is that Cloud remembered everything Zack told him while they were escaping, but instead of knowing it was Zack, he integrated his words into his own personality in order to cope with his trauma. And this also makes sense within the confines of the story. It explains why he was so out of it when Tifa found him at the train station in Sector 7. But that's not all that's left to do. There's yet another scene that will play in a hidden section of the world map. By using the submarine to go towards a hidden alcove, we can get behind a waterfall and find a hidden cave. It's here that Vincent meets a woman named Lucrecia. We're then brought to a flashback section in Nibelheim where we learn that Vincent used to be a member of the Turks. Lucrecia, apparently a Shinra researcher, spent a lot of time with Vincent, leading to him developing feelings for her. However, Lucrecia apparently already had a relationship with yet another Shinra researcher, Hojo. And I think you can already fill in somewhat of the blanks here. Lucrecia becomes pregnant with Hojo's child, who would grow up to be Sephiroth. However, we know Hojo performed experiments on Sephiroth in order to form him into what he would become during the story. The Jenova cells inside Lucrecia have an effect on her, as we can see scenes of her passing out. Apparently, Vincent then confronted Hojo about what he did, but instead of listening to him, Hojo instead shoots him and begins to perform experiments on his body as well. And this in turn led to Vincent becoming imbued with the power of chaos, after which he sealed himself away in the coffin in Shinra Mansion. In turn, it ends up that Lucrecia had also sealed herself away in this alcove, the Jenova cells inside her refusing to let her die. Lucrecia then asks us what happened to Sephiroth. This tells us she's unaware of the events happening outside of the cave. She wants to know if he is still alive somewhere, as the last she heard was that he died 5 years ago, and she chastises himself for being unfit to be called a mother. Unable to tell her the truth, Vincent instead tells her that Sephiroth is dead, choosing not to bring more heartache to the woman he loves. Now this story concludes on this side, and from the interaction you can tell that there was probably more to this in the original game. There's a section after this where you can return to the cave after having fought a few battles, which will give us Vincent's ultimate weapon, the death penalty, along with its last limit break, chaos. But wait, the side quests don't end there. Remember when Weapon came out of the northern crater? Well, there's actually the option to fight the remaining weapons, as they're considered to be the super bosses of the game. The 3 remaining weapons are Ruby Weapon, Emerald Weapon, and Ultimate Weapon. The first one we're going to fight is Ultimate Weapon. We'll find it flying around the world in some locations, and we have to bump into it with the airship in order to get into battle with it. We can't finish it off in one go, as every time its HP gets low enough, it will escape and go to another location, forcing us to redo this process. Eventually though, we'll face it one last time over Cosmo Canyon. Its attacks haven't changed from the time that we faced it back in Mideel. We're just a whole lot stronger by this point. Eventually, when Ultimate Weapon falls, we unlock Cloud's final weapon, the Ultima Weapon, which we can pick up by going towards the Ancient Forest. Now at this point you would probably want to continue to take down Ruby and Emerald Weapon as well, since they're the next challenge. I thought so too, and it went about as well as you expected. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, I know the strategies to taking down Ruby and Emerald Weapon. It involves using the Hades summon to stun Ruby Weapon and doing another side quest in Kalm to get an underwater material, which makes the fight with Emerald Weapon a lot easier since it takes away the time limit. Is it needed or important to the story though? No, not at all. You actually don't need to beat any of the weapons besides the one that the story forces you to. It's just a way for players to show that they were able to beat these characters and to get your hands on some very powerful materia and items. And with all of that done, we'll return to the Northern Crater. During this time, we'll be faced with several high-level battles, and the entire Northern Crater is just an endurance run of battles while we try to find out where the heck we have to go next. At some point we need to split up the team, and I just decided to stick with the team that I was most familiar with, Cloud, Tifa, and Vincent. Little by little, we get closer to the core of the Northern Crater where Sephiroth is waiting for us. But just before we get to him, there is one more obstacle in our way. It's time to face off against Jenova for the last time. This is Jenova Synthesis, and it consists of 3 parts, the main body and its 2 tentacles. To make this battle easier, it's best to focus on the 2 tentacles and then to focus on the main body. The thing to look out for is when Jenova starts counting down, as when she reaches 0, she will use a magic attack called Ultima, which does an insane amount of damage. She will die afterwards, but that's only if we manage to survive the spell. And when Jenova is finally defeated, we fall into the depths of the crater. And finally, after all this time, we come face to face with the true Sephiroth inside of his crystal. Sephiroth will use his powers to toy with the party, and we'll have to make a choice on which members we want to take into the final battle. The party that we choose will be able to break free from Sephiroth's power, and the team knows that this will be their final hurdle to unleash Holy and stop Meteor. We start off with Sephiroth taking on a form called Bizarro Sephiroth, and while it all seems to be one entity, we're actually fighting 5 different enemies, namely the head, the main body, the core, the left arm, and the right arm. All of these sections have their own HP, and there is a bit of a sequence in which they need to be beaten. The core is the most important in the beginning of the fight, as it will continue healing Sephiroth almost every turn. However, until the arms are gone, the core will be invincible, so we'll have to target these first. After the arms and the core are gone, it's time to focus on the body. Now, there's actually a way to tackle this battle with multiple parties. It's a calculation in the game which depends on the highest and lowest level character. After Bizarro Sephiroth's defeat, he'll switch into his next form, the angelic, safer Sephiroth. Now, I'm not completely sure if this name is correct or a mistranslation from the original Japanese name for this form, but seeing as that's what it's spelled as in-game, I'm just gonna stick with that now. Safer Sephiroth is the true final boss of the game, and my god does that show. His base health is based on a calculation and isn't static. He starts off with a base HP of 80,000 points, which is already significant, but it's increased by yet another 80,000 points if we attained a specific summon called Knights of the Round. On top of that, for every character at level 99, he gains yet another 30,000 hit points. While this form of Sephiroth has an array of incredibly destructive spells, he's also very predictable, as he follows the same 8-turn cycle over and over. Some of his most powerful spells are Heartless Angel, which reduces all of our health back to 1 for every character. Luckily for us, he'll only use it once he's at low health, and with a fully maxed out All and Restore materia, it is possible to heal up before we get hit by the next attack. But then, there's his attack called Supernova. And my god, this attack takes forever. I'm not kidding, the entire animation takes up to 2 minutes to finish and involves, I kid you not, summoning a comet from beyond the solar system that then destroys Pluto, the ring surrounding Saturn, and blowing a hole straight through Jupiter. Now this is also very confusing. I wasn't aware that the planet in this case is supposedly Earth, but I guess with Supernova we're beyond what makes sense at this point. But wait, it gets better. At the final part of the animation, the comet strikes the sun, making it turn into a supernova, which then destroys Mercury and Venus before finally engulfing both Sephiroth and the planet, doing an insane amount of damage. Seriously, with an attack like this, why were we worried about just Meteor? Now, I've seen a lot of debate regarding Supernova. If Sephiroth has this in his arsenal, why would he even care about Meteor? Well, I've read up on a lot of theories ranging from all of this is happening in an alternate universe to it being a sort of hallucination which just does an insane amount of damage. But regardless of all of that, it is one of the most badass attacks I've ever seen in a video game, and with the theme of One-Winged Angel playing in the background, I have not seen a lot of video games with battles that skirt the edges of absurdity like this while being this awesome at the same time. After finally defeating Safer Sephiroth, we climb back to the top of the crater. Cloud is confused, he senses something is off and collapses, grasping his head just like he did when he was being controlled. Suddenly, we're thrust into what is called the battle in the center of the mind with Sephiroth. Now, I'm not sure if this is an actual physical battle, or if this is showing us that Cloud is actively breaking free of the last hold that Sephiroth has on his mind. A last-ditch effort of the soldier to take over control of Cloud's body and live on. In any case, this is the final battle in the game. Actually, it's not even a battle. There's no way to lose, and the only command that we can do at this point is a limit break. It also doesn't matter if we got Cloud's final limit break Omnislash or not. Cloud will automatically have possession of it for this battle, and this battle alone, if the level 3 limit breaks were the last one that we got. We use Omnislash, which does a whopping 15 hits, and with it we finally defeat Sephiroth completely. A light begins to form around Cloud, presumably this is Holy starting to take effect now that Sephiroth is truly gone. Within the light, Aeris reaches out to Cloud and guides him back to safety alongside Tifa. The northern crater is beginning to crumble, and Cloud and Tifa barely survive as both of them almost fall into the depths. Cloud manages to catch her and tells Tifa that he finally understands the answer. Aeris isn't truly dead. She's part of the life stream just like everybody else that died. This means that at the end of their life, they can meet her again there. Cloud and Tifa see the rest of the party sitting across from them in the crater. Barret, Cid, and Red think this is it. The moment Holy begins to stir, they'll be right in the line of fire. All of a sudden, the high wind comes crashing down into the crater, and presumably the team has enough time to get on board, as the next shot is Holy bursting out from the northern crater, pushing the high wind out of it as well. With some quick thinking by Cid, the team is able to get away from the massive wave of energy. We then switch over to Marlene, who opens a window and witnesses Meteor being just shy of impacting the planet. The wave of holy energy gets to Meteor just in the nick of time, but it might just be too late. Meteor manages to break through Holy and is threatening to destroy Midgar along with people inside the city. Holy might have just been too late to stop Sephiroth's attack. So this is it. All seems to be lost until Tifa witnesses a green mass of energy shoot out of the planet. It's the life stream, and in what I can only call a beautiful moment, it starts to head towards Midgar, where Meteor is almost about to destroy the city. The life stream joins with Holy, and this would be the point where you would expect a powerful scene where we see Meteor being destroyed. However, it never comes. We only see a flash of light before Aeris' face shows up, looking at the camera in almost the exact same way she did in the beginning of the game. And then the credits roll. Now, if this were 1997, this would be confusing. What the heck actually happened here? Was the planet saved or was it destroyed? By now, because Final Fantasy VII has already had many sequels such as Advent Children and Dirge of Cerberus, we know that the planet was saved. But I can completely understand that before all of this ending was considered ambiguous. But there's a little bit left to go. Just like a Marvel movie, we'll get a short final scene at the end of the credits. We see who we can only suspect to be Red, running across a valley with two smaller members of his species, presumably his kids, alongside him. After a few seconds, they end up at the ruins of Midgar, which at this point has been completely covered in vegetation. And at the end of this last scene, we can hear the laughter of children, which tells me that the planet has survived. And with that, we've come to the conclusion of the story of Final Fantasy VII, and what a ride it was. Story-wise, the game still delivers after all these years. I'm sure by this time most of you have already played through FF7 at least once, but if you decide to pick it up again sometime in the future, or you're going to try it for the first time, know that the game definitely still delivers. From the escape of Midgar to Aeris' death scene to the final battle with Sephiroth, the story will keep you engaged. And before you go into that final battle, I suggest checking out all the towns and places for the additional storylines that you might have missed. Graphically, it's rough. The PC and PS4 version do a good job of polishing it up, but there's only so much that you can do with a game made in 1997. If you look at it through nostalgia goggles, I'm sure you can still see them as acceptable. But even though they're not offensive in any way, don't expect too much graphically, especially in the storyline and world map sections. The battle sections, however, are actually pretty good. The non-deformed character models still look acceptable, and I didn't mind looking at them during the numerous battle sequences. But all in all, what is it that made Final Fantasy VII so loved to the point that it had the remake treatment that people wanted for so many years? To be fair, I don't know, and I don't think that there is a set answer that fits all in this case. Some people love the characters so much they wanted to see the story again in a modern format. For some, the world was so vibrant and interesting that they just wanted to see a modern take on it, and for some people, the gap to playing a game from 1997 is just too big, and they wanted to experience the story for the first time in a modern iteration of the game. For me personally, it was the amalgamation of both the story and the characters themselves. They felt like properly written and interesting characters, especially Cloud's internal struggle as he comes to terms with what of his own backstory is real and what's not. It showcases a broken person trying to piece together what is left of himself in an effort to finally come into his own personality. In a sense, Cloud is both realizing and accepting. that even though he might not have become what he aspired to be all those years ago, he is still his own person, and he has a right to exist. Barrett's backstory is tragic, but seeing him trying and mostly succeeding after all these years to make amends for what he felt was his own mistake was the perfect way to close his story off. He's forgiven himself for something that he thinks he did, and forgiving oneself for past mistakes is one of the key elements of being an adult. And then there's Tifa. To me, she's always been the voice of reason in the party, bridging the gap between Cloud's aloofness and Barrett's hot-headed personality, which often clash in the beginning of the game. In my understanding, her growth stems from her acceptance of the events of Nibelheim and turning this trauma into perseverance, which allows her to give her full 100% into stopping Sephiroth from destroying the planet. Her relationship with Cloud is complicated due to their past and their experiences, but seeing it blossom at the end of the game is a sweet thing to behold. And then Aeris. Her story will always remain tragic, no matter how many times I play through the game. Her role changes from being an active party member to overseeing the group's progress from the livestream, almost taking on a sort of deity-like role that watches them from the beyond. I think it might become clearer if you've seen Advent Children, the movie which is a sequel to the original FF7 story. Quick spoiler warning if you haven't seen the movie, but I'm gonna talk about it, so you might want to skip this part. Aerith shows up throughout the movie and actively assists the team in helping people get rid of the geostigma that is plaguing them. Even though after all these years there is still no official way to bring her back to life, she is always right there with the others, guiding them and even assisting them from beyond the mortal realm at the end of the game. In a sense, she is still very much alive. Red 13's story comes to a conclusion by the time that you reach Cosmo Canyon. His story mostly revolves around his forgiving his father and dealing with the aftermath of having the wrong ideas about him all these years. After the ordeal in the cave, Red is on his path to becoming an adult, looking up to the sacrifice that his father made. He still has somewhat immature tendencies within him though, as when Bugenhagen tells him that he won't be around forever. Red denies the fact that Bugenhagen is old and claims that he's nowhere near the end of his life. It's this trait which shows the immaturity of a person who's not yet ready to accept that people around him will eventually die, and it shows that he still has growth. In the end, we see Red with his own children running towards the ruins of Midgar. We have to assume that he's finally become a full-fledged adult, but unfortunately there's no dialogue from which we can distinguish this. As for Yuffie and Cait Sith, I'm gonna put these two together. They've always been the comedic relief characters of the group. Yuffie's story is mostly resolved by her beating her father in Wutai, but I can't say that she went through an awful lot of growth during the course of the story. This is to be expected. A lot of content was cut during the end of development, and I can understand that her story might be one of them. Luckily, we have the addition to FF7 Remake, Intergrade. This fleshes out her story quite a bit. As for Cait Sith, he isn't really the character that we should be focusing on. It's Reeve. Reeve has been with us through thick and thin, and even though there was the betrayal involving the Black Materia, he tried his best to make up for it. I think the best way to describe him is as this member of an evil corporation who knows he's on the wrong side, but feels that he can do more good from inside that corporation than out there in the field directly. And then there's Cid. Cid was a character that I heavily disliked from his treatment of Shera. Throughout the course of the story though, he steps up, becoming an alternative leader of the group and eventually coming to terms that what happened with the rocket was not Shera's fault. In the end, he actually turned out to be a fun guy with a somewhat gruff personality, and I liked him quite a lot more. And then finally, we have Vincent. Vincent's story, in my opinion, is amazing. Here's a man who has effectively lost everything, even his humanity, and all he gets for it in the end is that his true love is locked away in crystal for what seems to be forever, the Genova cells inside of her making her incapable of dying. I wish they could have done a lot more with him, but seeing him in the trailer for Rebirth has gotten my hopes up that they'll flesh out his story even more, maybe in the same way that they did with Yuffie and integrate. But in any case, I think I've kept you guys occupied for far too long already. If you made it to the end of the video without skipping anything, congratulations. It's probably been a few hours, but thank you for sitting through the entire thing. If you decided to skip to this part, thank you as well. I'm glad you took the time to check the video out. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to drop a like on the video or subscribe to the channel itself. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I would appreciate it if you did. As always, feel free to give me any feedback in the comments that you'd like. Do you agree with the things that I talked about in the video, or do you disagree? There's no wrong feedback, and looking at the length of this video, I do not doubt that there are things that I either missed or maybe I thought about wrongly. Thanks for watching, and from my family to yours, I hope you guys have a fantastic start of the new year. I'll be working on my next video, and hopefully I'll be able to churn this one out a lot faster than I did this one. But looking at the release schedule for 2024, specifically looking at February, I think I have a lot of recording to do. In any case, I'll see you later, buddy. Take care.